Hi guys. Tonight we ease into the long corridors of a medieval winter, and you picture yourself stepping into a royal castle just as a vicious cold settles over the stone. You feel the night around you tighten like a fist. Your breath leaves a faint cloud in the frigid air, and you get the immediate sense that if you had to survive here for more than a few hours without help, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, tell me where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, and you push deeper into the castle, boots tapping gently across uneven floors, your fingertips brushing against walls colder than anything you know today. You walk through a corridor that feels like the inside of a mountain. The air carries a faint mineral smell, a cold that almost tastes metallic as it slides into your lungs. Every step makes you more aware of how the medieval world lived with winter as a constant opponent, a sly enemy lurking behind every window crack and unlit corner. Even kings, wrapped in privilege, money, and power, trembled under the weight of icy months that stretched on endlessly. And as you reach a small landing window and glance out at a dark courtyard glazed with frost, you begin to understand why every detail of royal sleep became a matter of strategy, ritual, and survival. You move forward and hear the echo of your own steps ripple into the dark. The corridor narrows, the draft sharpens, and then you remember one mainstream historical fact that always surprises people. Medieval stone castles were never designed for comfort. They were fortresses first and homes second. Thick walls trapped cold as efficiently as they repelled invaders, leaving even the wealthiest monarchs shivering unless they actively fought back against the elements. It is no coincidence that chroniclers often describe kings rising in the morning with stiff limbs, sore joints, and breath so cold it frosted their moustaches. Your hand slides across a narrow slit window. A gust of air needles across your knuckles, and you pull your sleeve down without thinking. The silence around you deepens, but not in a peaceful way. Instead, it has the emptiness of long, barren winters, when every sound seems swallowed by frost. Somewhere far below, you imagine the faint clatter of servants carrying wood or stirring embers, each person performing a task that determined whether the king managed to wake up refreshed or half frozen. Historians still argue whether medieval monarchs truly acclimated to this level of cold, or simply endured it because no one had a better option. A soft, scraping sound echoes in the distance. You turn your head, half expecting to see a guard or a servant. Nothing, just the breath of winter drifting through these halls like a living thing. And as you continue, you recall a quirky tidbit. Some medieval people believed that cold could seep into bones and stay there permanently, causing long-term weakness. Kings sometimes wore amulets or small charms sewn into their clothing, meant to repel the chill. Whether it worked or not is irrelevant. What matters is the fear behind the gesture, the constant awareness that the cold was not just unpleasant, but dangerous. You reach a wider landing and pause near a wooden door reinforced with iron bands. Candles burn on brackets nearby, their flames swaying in a draught that feels like a whisper against your cheek. The warmth is minimal, barely enough to make a difference, but you lean toward it on instinct, savoring whatever heat it gives. In the king's time, this entire section of the castle might have been warmer, but only by a margin so small it would not impress you. Fires roared for hours, yet most of their heat vanished straight up the chimney, a waste so familiar that no one even bothered mentioning it in routine records. Your boots scrape faintly as you move again. The soothing rhythm of walking in dim light settles over you, and as you wander, you begin to grasp the central truth this entire journey explores. Medieval kings lived in a world without insulation, without glass windows in many cases, without central heating, without weatherproofing, without even the modern understanding of airflow. They battled cold nights using layers, rituals, and clever design, but they never approached the comfort of a modern heated bedroom. For them, Sleep in winter was both precious and precarious, a nightly negotiation between human warmth and the chill of stone. A gust of wind moans softly through a hidden gap, and the sound makes you pause. There is something eerie about hearing wind inside a building meant to project power and permanence. You breathe slowly, letting the sound fade, and your shoulders relax. The quiet darkness feels almost meditative now, as if the cold itself invites you to slow down and pay attention. You can sense why bedtime became such an involved process for royalty. The king had to be wrapped, protected, insulated. His chamber had to be warmed by servants. His bed had to be prepared like a battlefield position. And you can almost feel the weight of all those preparations building around you. You round another corner, and at last you glimpse the faint O shape of a door that leads into what would have been a royal sleeping chamber. You push it open slowly. The hinges creak in a low, almost apologetic tone. Inside, the darkness is softer, more private, with a faint scent of old wood and extinguished candles. The floor beneath you loses some of its chill as thick rugs mute your steps. And as you stand there, taking in the quiet space where a powerful ruler once slept shivering in winter, you understand exactly why the next sections will guide you deeper into the warm strategies and cold realities of royal sleep. You take one last slow breath, letting the air settle in your chest, and step forward toward the massive bed waiting in the shadows. You glide deeper into the chamber, and the first thing your eyes adjust to is the immense shape of the royal bed. It rises from the dimness like its own fortress within a fortress, a hulking structure of carved wood, thick posts and heavy drapery that nearly grazes the ceiling. You step closer, and you feel the cool air around you shift, as if even the darkness respects this sleeping beast of furniture. In the medieval world, the king's bed was not just a place to collapse after a long day. It was a defensive zone, a carefully managed pocket of warmth and safety in a castle that leaked cold through every seam. As you approach, you notice the scale of it. The frame stretches wider than any modern king-size mattress you know. Some were nearly square. Others were long enough to accommodate more than one person if needed. A mainstream historical fact you might recognize is that medieval monarchs often slept semi-upright, propped with bolsters and cushions. They believed it aided digestion. They also feared lying fully flat could invite bad humors. This meant the bed itself had to be built for posture as much as comfort. You run your hand along the wooden canopy frame, and the grain under your fingertips feels ancient, almost fossilized in its chill. Servants once circled this bed like attendants around an altar. They checked the cords that held the underside firm. They examined the mattress stuffed with wool, feathers, or sometimes straw. In many palaces, the royal mattress was layered with incredible care because a king was expected to sleep well enough to rule effectively. A monarch who shivered through the night might wake irritable or unwell, and that mattered in a world where decisions often hinged on the ruler's personal mood. Historians still argue whether these layers truly offered more comfort than the simpler bedding used by commoners. Some records suggest kings still complained about stiffness. Others celebrate the luxury. You can feel the debate whispering through the silence of this chamber. A quirky tidbit emerges in your mind as you lean close. Some kings added waxed cloth beneath the mattress. The reason was not entirely warmth, it was to block pests. The cloth also trapped some heat, but the main purpose was to discourage insects that crept in from the colder cracks of the castle. You imagine the rustle of those creatures and feel a subtle shiver crawl along the back of your neck. You circle the bed slowly, taking in how imposing it must have seemed to anyone invited into the royal chamber. This was not merely furniture, it was a statement. The bed told the world that within these curtains slept the center of the kingdom. Every inch radiated authority and proclaimed that while the castle might freeze, the monarch enjoyed at least the illusion of warmth. The posts are thick enough to anchor sails. The carvings show leaves, beasts, saints, or heraldic symbols. The canopy frame narrows the space above the sleeping king, trapping heat as effectively as medieval craftsmanship could manage. You stand at the side where servants would have opened the curtains in the evening. Imagine the faint rustle of fabric drawn aside. Imagine the tiny flare of a candle illuminating the bedding. You can almost see the moment when the king stepped close, feeling the heat gathered inside the fabric cocoon. That small pocket of warmth would have been precious during winter. Even a slight rise in temperature meant a better chance at a peaceful night. You place your palm flat on the thick outer blanket folded near the foot. In reality, it would have been warmer, often layered with wool or fur. This bed had to function as an island of heat. Castles might hold fires, but the hearth never heated the entire room. Warmth collected near the bed instead, not by magic, but by sheer accumulation of materials. You can imagine the king slipping beneath the covers, his breath fogging in front of him as he settled in, the cold nipping at him even as the heavy blankets pressed down. You lean forward, inspecting the bed ropes. These cords crisscross beneath the mattress. If they sagged, the king's rest suffered. Servants tightened them with a twisting device until they were firm. From this tradition came the old phrase, "sleep tight." You touch the frame again, feeling the rough wood warmed only slightly by the surrounding rugs. Everything about this space reminds you that medieval comfort depended on preparation. No one simply fell into bed. It was a process. You kneel briefly to examine the rugs beneath your boots. They help absorb heat rather than allowing cold to seep straight upward from the stone. This layering became essential in winter. You can almost feel the change underfoot. The stone beyond the rugs is colder, sharper, biting at your soles. Inside the bed area, the air feels slightly gentler, as if it knows this corner carries a royal purpose. You inhale and pick up a faint scent of old wool and faded herbs that might have been used centuries ago to freshen the bedding. A flicker of candlelight dances along the bed's inner curtains, and you imagine their weight. These were not thin, whimsical drapes. They were thick and often lined with fur or heavy cloth. When pulled fully shut, they created a small tent of warmth around the monarch, trapping the king's body heat and whatever warmth servants had managed to insert beforehand. You run your hand along the inner edge of one curtain. The fabric feels sturdy, meant for survival, not beauty. Your fingertips catch a slight roughness. You pause and realize this might have been where a servant once tied the curtain back. It is easy to picture the quick hands of a chamber attendant, trained to work in near darkness so the king would not be disturbed. You let your hand fall, feeling the cool air gather around your wrist. The bed is grand, yes, but it is also practical. You picture winter nights when storms howled beyond the walls. The king, high in his chamber, likely heard the wind sneaking into the smallest cracks. He may have felt the thin, cold wisps brushing across the floor, climbing the posts, searching for openings between the curtains. The bed acted as a final barrier. Without it, even royalty would have shivered all night. You step back and take in the full sight again. Everything leads inward. The posts, the canopy, the drapery, the mattresses, the blankets, they all draw the king toward warmth. It is striking how much effort went into protecting one person from cold. And yet, for all the layers and precautions, the monarch still experienced winter in a way you never could today. The cold was not kept out. It was merely slowed. You let the moment linger. Then your gaze drifts naturally toward the next element in the room, the blankets waiting to smother the king in heavy layers, and you feel the story pulling you toward that pile of warmth waiting on the mattress. You step closer to the enormous mound of bedding resting on the royal mattress, and you immediately sense just how central layers were to surviving a medieval winter. The pile does not look delicate or graceful. It looks heavy, purposeful, almost like soft armor stacked for nighttime battle. You reach out and press your fingers into the topmost blanket. It yields slowly, resisting with a dense, reassuring weight. In this world of icy corridors and stone walls that hold cold like a secret, these layers are the king's first real defense. You lift a corner of the nearest coverlet. It is thick wool, coarse enough to prickle your fingertips, yet soft in that dependable medieval way. You imagine it being woven by skilled hands who understood that warmth was not a luxury, it was survival. A mainstream historical fact comes to mind. Medieval elites used textiles in astonishing quantities. Royal accounts show that some monarchs owned dozens of blankets and quilts, often made from expensive dyed wool or imported fabrics. These were prized possessions, guarded carefully, repaired repeatedly, and stored with herbs to keep moths away. You let the wool fall back, then slide your hand under another layer. This one feels smoother, perhaps lined with linen. Beneath it lies something far heavier. You pull it up slightly and feel the unmistakable heft of fur. Kings favoured furs for warmth in winter, not only for their insulating ability but also for status. Sable, ermine, fox, and even beaver-lined beds throughout Europe. The fur layers trapped body heat so effectively that once the king settled beneath them, the warmth built slowly and steadily, making the cold of the room seem far away. Historians still argue whether fur bedding was more common among northern kings than southern ones, or whether these traditions depended more on personal taste than climate. The record offers hints, but no definitive answer. As you sift through the layers, you encounter a quirky tidbit that brings a faint smile. Some royal households stitched bells, or small charms, into the corners of blankets to ward off spirits believed to slip in during the coldest nights. Whether the king actually believed in these charms or simply tolerated them because they amused the staff, you cannot say. But the thought of a monarch wrapped in blankets that jingled faintly when adjusted adds an unexpectedly human detail to this heavy bedding. As you sift through the layers, you encounter a quirky tidbit that brings a faint smile. Some royal households stitched bells, or small charms, into the corners of blankets to ward off spirits believed to slip in during the coldest nights. Whether the king actually believed in these charms or simply tolerated them because they amused the staff, you cannot say. You fold back a corner of the top blanket and notice stitching so small it nearly disappears into the weave. These blankets were not simply bought, they were maintained. Royal tailors and laundresses worked tirelessly to keep them usable. Washing heavy wool in winter was nearly impossible, so they brushed, aired, and beat the blankets to clean them. You imagine servants shaking them outside during daylight, flakes of snow drifting from the folds, each shake sending small clouds of dust swirling in the pale light. You climb onto the edge of the bed, placing your weight gently upon the firm surface. The layers compress, but do not flatten. The structure beneath is strong. Even the mattress, often stuffed with feathers for kings, offers resistance. You lie back briefly, just to feel the sensation. The blankets sink around you with a reassuring density. It is not like modern bedding, light and fluffy. This is weighty enough to pin you slightly. That heaviness helps hold warmth close, cocooning you in a pocket of heat while the air outside remains sharp and unforgiving. You imagine the king slipping under these covers. It must have been a slow, deliberate process. Servants often helped arrange the layers over him, adjusting them until the monarch was properly buried in warmth. You can almost hear the soft rustle of fabric, the faint grunt of a servant lifting a heavy fur quilt into position. In winter, layering was a science. Too few blankets meant shivering. Too many meant sweating and discomfort. The right balance had to be found each night. You shift slightly, noticing how the air cools instantly when you expose even a small part of your body. The medieval king experienced the same. If he kicked off a blanket in his sleep, a freezing draught sneaked in. That sudden chill could wake him, or at the very least make the night far less restful. You picture the king half asleep, tugging the covers tighter, cocooning himself in warmth while the wind outside scraped against the shutters like claws. You sit up slowly, running your hand along the outermost layer again. It feels like a barrier between you and the harsh world beyond these walls. You understand why layering became an art form in royal households. Some layers were decorative, embroidered with golden thread or edged with velvet. Others were purely functional, thick and plain. The true power came from their combination. As you picture the complexity of these coverings, you marvel at how much effort went into something as simple as staying warm. You shift closer to the head of the bed and notice several cushions piled neatly. These too played a role. By propping the king upright, they allowed warm air to remain trapped around his chest. If he reclined too far horizontally, heat could escape more easily. This posture also helped him breathe better in cold, dense air. You imagine the king adjusting these cushions with a sleepy grunt, seeking just the right position. You lean forward and rest your hand lightly on the fur layer again. It is soft beneath your fingertips despite the thickness. The fur holds a subtle warmth, even now, simply from its natural insulation. You think of all the animals whose pelts once lined royal beds. A strange mix of admiration and melancholy flickers in your chest. Cold demanded sacrifice in medieval times. Warmth always had a price. You let the layers settle back into place, watching how they fall silently into soft hills and gentle folds. Then you step down from the bed, your boots meeting the rug with a muted thump. The bedding seems to breathe, waiting for the next moment someone will slip between its layers. You turn slightly, your gaze drifting toward the heavy curtains that hang around the bed. If the blankets are the king's armor, those curtains are the walls of his private winter fortress. And just like that, you feel the story guiding you toward them. You draw closer to the tall curtains that frame the royal bed, and the moment you touch them, you understand why they mattered so much. The fabric is thick, almost theatrical in weight, and when your fingertips press into it, you sense how easily it could trap the faintest hint of warmth. These curtains form a cocoon, an intimate sanctuary inside a room that never truly shakes off winter's grip. As you slide your hand along the inner edge, a soft hush settles over you, as if the air inside this canopy waits patiently to be awakened. You brush the curtain aside and step into the enclosed space. Instantly, the atmosphere changes. Even though the castle around you remains cold, this small compartment feels quieter, closer, more protected. You can understand why medieval monarchs relied on enclosed beds. Without them, the slightest draught could steal warmth from a sleeper. Here, though, the king lay shielded, surrounded by a private pocket of stillness that kept the worst of the winter at bay. A detail, often mentioned in surviving records, tells us that these bed curtains were lined with whatever the household could afford. In the wealthiest courts, that meant heavy damask, velvet or fur trim. In more practical setups, thick wool did the job just as well. The intention was always the same: seal in heat and silence. You can imagine the king sitting at the edge of the bed, watching servants draw the curtains closed with slow, careful motions, each swish of fabric signaling his retreat from the icy world outside. You inhale softly, picking up the faint mustiness that old cloth carries after countless winters. Yet mixed with it is the ghost of herbs once tucked into folds to keep insects away. Lavender, rosemary or meadowsweet, their scents faded long ago, but the memory of them lingers, gentle and comforting. You let the curtain fall behind you, and its weight shuts out the chamber so completely that the outside world seems to vanish. Inside this enclosed space, sound behaves differently. Your breath feels louder, more intimate. The faint creak of the bed frame beneath your shifting weight seems amplified. You can sense how calming this environment must have been after a day spent dealing with councils, petitions, and political bickering. Here, the king could finally let his shoulders sag. And perhaps on nights when a storm rattled the shutters, these curtains softened the noise, turning harsh wind into a distant murmur that lulled him towards sleep. You run your hand along the inner line of stitches. One curious note that appears in old castle inventories is the mention of winter curtain sets and summer curtain sets. The winter versions were thicker, often doubled, while summer sets were lighter and more decorative. Even kings adjusted their bedding environments with the seasons, proving that comfort in a drafty stone residence required constant adaptation. You settle onto the mattress again, this time inside the curtain enclosure. The space feels smaller now, deliberately confined. When you pull the curtains partly shut, even the dim candlelight outside becomes muted, filtered through layers of fabric. You can see why the bed became a world unto itself, a chamber within a chamber, a fortress within a fortress. As you rest your hand on the bedding, you consider how different this experience would have felt centuries ago. The small warmth generated by the king's own body would accumulate inside the curtains over time. It might not have reached modern comfort levels, but in comparison to the biting air outside, it would have felt heavenly. Servants sometimes warmed the space beforehand by placing heated objects inside for a few minutes, letting the curtains hold in every scrap of warmth they could muster. You shift slightly, and the curtain brushes your arm, cool at first but slowly accepting your body heat. This enclosure does not pretend to warm the entire bed. Instead, it creates a simple principle you can feel even now: stop the cold from getting in. By eliminating drafts, controlling airflow, and holding pockets of heat, these curtains turn the bed into a survival tool. Some researchers highlight an amusing disagreement about how much privacy these enclosures actually offered. In some courts, the king might share his chamber with guards, servants, or companions. The curtains did shield him visually, but the soft glow of candlelight from inside the bed could betray motion, and the rustle of blankets was hardly silent. Still, compared to the open chill of the room, the enclosed bed must have felt like night and day. You reach up and touch the canopy above your head. It is wood, carved with patterns that seem to twist in the dim light. The canopy served two purposes. It held the curtains and slowed the upward escape of warm air. Even a small difference in ceiling height inside the enclosure mattered. The king slept under a wooden roof within his bedroom, a miniature shelter that kept his warmth swirling around him, rather than drifting away into the vast cold chamber. You can imagine the ritual of entering this cocoon. The king finishes his final conversation with attendants. They lower the curtains partway as he climbs into bed. Then, with gentle precision, they draw them shut, sealing him inside. Only the faintest strip of light escapes through the overlapping folds, glowing like a line of molten amber in a dark cave. Inside, he adjusts the blankets around his shoulders, listens briefly to the muted sounds of the castle settling into night, and eventually drifts into the soft breathing rhythm of sleep. You shift the curtains slightly, letting a sliver of cool air slip in. It slides across your cheek like a cold finger, reminding you how unforgiving the room outside remains. In that moment, the genius of this design becomes obvious. This curtain barrier did not need to be a perfect seal. It just needed to soften the cold long enough for the king's body heat to take over. You can almost picture the king unconsciously curling deeper under the blankets, letting the warmth collect inside this hidden chamber. You trace the seam where two pieces of fabric meet. Some accounts mention decorative tassels and embroidered patterns meant only for those who stepped inside the inner space. That private beauty speaks to the intimacy of royal rest. People expect grandeur in public halls, but the secret finery hidden behind curtains often meant more to the monarch. It was a small reminder of comfort in a world dominated by hard edges and colder duties. Your head tilts upward again, and for a moment you imagine lying here during a harsh midwinter storm, wind roaring through the battlements, snow smacking against shutters, the chilled air creeping under the door. Yet here, in this small enclosed bed, the storm becomes an echo. You feel the calm it brings, the soothing sense of being tucked away while the world rages outside. You draw one curtain fully open and step out slowly. The shift in temperature is immediate. The ambient cold of the chamber wraps around you like a reminder that the king could never escape winter, only outsmart it for a few hours at a time. As your gaze drifts from the curtains back to the room, your attention naturally falls toward the next warming strategy waiting for you. Someone must have prepared this bed before the king entered it, using clever methods and warm hands. And you begin to walk toward the quiet corner where those attendants once worked. You angle your steps toward the quiet corner where royal attendants once worked long before the king ever slipped beneath his blankets. The chamber feels broader out here, the cold more immediate. A faint chill grazes your neck as if reminding you that for all the bed's cozy engineering, nothing happened by accident. Everything began with the people who prepared it. You pause near a small wooden table, its surface worn smooth by centuries of hands, and imagine the bustle that used to fill this very space. Servants moving softly, whispering instructions, carrying items meant to warm the bed before the monarch approached. You lean down to inspect a shallow wooden box lined with faded cloth. It once held embers or warmed fabric. Attendants often carried such tools up countless stairs, their boots clunking lightly in unison. One recorded detail from palace accounts reveals that warming the king's bed could involve several steps. First, servants brought in heated stones or freshly ironed cloths. Then they slipped these beneath the covers to fill the bedding with trapped heat. As you brush your fingers against the box's edge, you try to imagine how busy, how coordinated this process became on winter nights. Your imagination drifts toward those attendants, bundled in layers of rough wool, breathing in cold air that stung their throats. While the king enjoyed the final result, his comfort depended entirely on their skill. Many were trained specifically for chamber duties, knowing exactly how long a heated object should stay in the bedding before it became too cool to matter. Some of these attendants acted almost like human heaters themselves. They leaned over the bed, spreading their own warmth through brief contact, warming pillows beneath their sleeves, or standing inside the curtains for a few minutes to soften the chill within. You run your fingertips across the wooden surface again, feeling the grooves left behind by countless nights of preparation. It is strange to think that something as small as a servant's breath could influence the king's comfort. Yet old household manuals hint at this idea. Servants were expected to handle bedding gently, mindful of not letting too much cold air rush in. In a world without central heating, every warm body in the room mattered. You picture the attendants quietly exhaling warm breaths across linen folds as they fluffed them, not as a deliberate technique but as an accidental gift to the cold chamber. You stand, close your eyes, and try to hear the faint echoes of their movements, the soft swish of fabric being lifted, the scrape of a chair, the muted thump of a warmed stone placed carefully on the mattress. One offbeat detail preserved in a castle inventory suggests that some households kept specific staff known informally as bed warmers. Their tasks involved testing the bed's temperature with their own hands or cheeks, adjusting the layers until they judged it suitable for the monarch. It is an oddly intimate job, and you can imagine the pressure to get it right. A draft curls around your ankle, nudging you to move closer to the edge of the bed where attendants would have gathered. You press your palm onto the mattress again. The cold seeps up instantly, reminding you of why the preparation mattered. Without careful preheating, the king might have recoiled the moment he touched the bed. Cold bedding was not just uncomfortable. It could stiffen joints, worsen aches, and risk illness in a period when winter ailments posed real dangers. Several experts note ongoing debates about how much nighttime cold contributed to royal health problems, from rheumatism to lingering respiratory issues. You straighten up, picturing the scene moments before the king entered the chamber. A servant adjusts the last blanket corner, another smooths the pillow. A third stands ready with a candle, guiding the monarch toward the warmest possible bed. The attendants then retreat to the edges of the room or step outside entirely, leaving behind a gentle hush. Their warmth fades from the air, but their work lingers in the bedding, waiting for the king's arrival. You move toward the hearth at the opposite side of the chamber, stepping lightly across chilled stone. Before reaching it, you pause to reflect on the human presence that shaped the room each night. While the medieval world often imagines kings as solitary and powerful, the truth is that their comfort relied on ordinary people whose names rarely appear in chronicles. Their silent contributions guarded the king against the biting cold. Their careful timing ensured the bedding held warmth long enough for him to fall asleep. You breathe in deeply, and the air tastes faintly of old soot and winter air. You can almost see the attendants slipping out one by one, leaving the king alone in the dim glow of candles. The bed, warmed by human hands, becomes the centerpiece of his nighttime haven. But warmth did not end with layered blankets and curtain-covered canopies. The room itself needed some degree of heat, however unreliable, and the heart of that effort glows quietly behind you. You turn last toward the waiting fireplace, its blackened interior looming like a reminder that even royal chambers depended on flames that behaved imperfectly. The warmth from servants could not last forever. The fire had to take over, and your feet carry you closer to that ancient hearth, ready to learn how much effort it took to coax heat from stone walls that seemed determined to remain cold. You approach the old fireplace with slow, measured steps, and even before you reach it, you sense the subtle shift in atmosphere. The air becomes a little softer here, a fraction less biting, as if some memory of ancient fire still lingers inside the soot-darkened stones. You stand before the hearth and place your hand near its opening. There is no warmth now, only the cool breath of a chamber long unused. Yet you imagine the flames that once roared inside it, struggling to push back the winter cold that seeped relentlessly through the castle walls. You crouch slightly to study the firebox. It is large enough to hold stout logs, but not designed to heat the room evenly. Fireplaces in medieval castles were temperamental. They smoked one night, blazed too fiercely the next, and sometimes behaved like sullen beasts refusing to warm their keeper. One practical detail preserved in period building accounts tells us that royal hearths required constant tending. Servants stood guard through the night to adjust logs, stir embers, and keep the flames alive. Without them, the temperature in the chamber dropped with startling speed. Your eyes trace the tall chimney stretching upward. You tilt your head, imagining how much heat escaped straight through that funnel. The medieval world lacked the efficiency of modern fireplaces. Much of the warmth soared into the night sky, leaving the king with only a fraction of the fire's output. This inefficiency is one reason the bed curtains mattered so deeply. The fireplace could glow brightly, yet the far corners of the room stayed cold enough to chill water left in a bowl overnight. You rise and extend your arm toward the stone mantel. Its surface is worn smooth, not by ornamentation but by generations of hands leaning in to warm themselves. You picture a servant adding a fresh log, sparks snapping against the iron grate. The glow would reach the king's face from across the chamber, but the heat might never fully arrive. Many modern historians point out that castle fireplaces produced more psychological comfort than physical warmth. The sight of fire signaled security, even if its temperature barely touched the room. You let your fingertips hover over the stones. The texture feels dry, rough, like an ancient reptile's hide. Between the darker patches, a hint of reddish-brown clay peeks through, suggesting repairs made long ago. Your thoughts wander to an unusual reference found in a household roll from a royal estate. It mentions a specific mixture of herbs burned on cold nights, not for heat but for scent. The smoky sweetness of juniper or sage helped mask the odors of damp wool and wet boots. Such small touches remind you that warmth in the medieval sense often included emotional comfort, not just temperature. You take a slow breath, trying to picture the room as it once looked with firelight dancing across the stone. Shadows would have swayed like silent dancers on the walls. The glow might have softened the carved wooden furniture, turning hard edges into warm silhouettes. Yet even then, drafts would creep along the floor like invisible cats, hunting any gap in the bedding or curtain where they could slip through. Your gaze settles on the iron tools leaning against the hearth. A poker, a thick pair of tongs and shovel for ash. They seem humble, but each held responsibility. The firekeeper had to watch the flames carefully. Too much fuel meant smoke choking the room. Too little meant the king woke shivering. Some specialists today talk about the long-standing disagreement surrounding medieval heating technology. Opinions vary on whether upper floors of great halls truly stayed warmer or simply accumulated smoke. The architecture differed from castle to castle, and no single rule applied. You straighten, letting your hand drift across the mantel's edge. You can almost hear the muted roar of a well-fed fire, the crackling rhythm settling into a steady hum. That sound alone could lull a tired king. Fire had a meditative quality in these cold rooms. It served as both comfort and companion. The flames felt alive, something to watch on sleepless nights when winter storms raged beyond the keep. You imagine the king standing here before retiring to bed. He warms his palms, rotates slowly, allows heat to seep into his bones. Servants behind him await instructions. A log shifts, sparks leap upward, and the king steps back with instinctive caution. Fire was necessary, but never fully trusted. One odd reference from a later chronicle describes a royal chamber that nearly caught fire when a stray ember landed on a fur blanket. The incident became a whispered reminder. Warmth could turn dangerous if handled carelessly. You turn slightly to look back at the bed. Even with a roaring fire, that bed remained the true source of warmth during sleep. The fire served mainly to warm the air just enough to keep the king from entering the bed fully chilled. In some palaces, the fire might die down overnight, leaving only glowing embers by dawn. The room would cool rapidly, making morning routines brisk and unpleasant. Water froze inside pitchers. Clothing stiffened. Servants hurried with warm cloths to ease the king's waking discomfort. You step back from the fireplace, feeling the cold reclaim the space around you. The hearth no longer burns, but you still sense its importance. It was never perfect. It was never modern, yet it symbolized light, heat, and protection in a world where winter could be merciless. Fire remained unpredictable, but it was the best tool they had, a reminder that warmth was a daily struggle. As you turn away, the dim chamber stretches before you once more, shadows heavy and still. Your eyes drift toward the areas beyond the bed and hearth, where the rules of warmth blended with the rules of hierarchy. Not everyone in this room enjoyed heat equally. Status shaped comfort, even on the coldest nights. And your steps naturally carry you toward that subtle, social edge of winter. You stand in the dim glow of the cooled hearth, feeling the chill slowly reclaim the floor beneath your feet. As your eyes adjust again to the stillness, you become aware of something subtle threading through the chamber. Warmth in a medieval castle was never just physical. It was social, it was political. It was a privilege dealt out according to rank. Even here, inside the king's private winter refuge, the air held invisible lines dividing who felt the cold and who did not. You walk slowly toward a long bench tucked against the far wall. Its wooden surface is stiff with cold. When you brush your fingertips across it, the temperature bites instantly into your skin. For lower-ranking attendants who stood or sat near the edges of the chamber, this was the climate they endured night after night. They were close enough to witness the glow of the king's fire, close enough to feel the heat in their imagination, yet still too far away for warmth to ever reach them. One well-documented practice from royal households shows how access to heating was determined by hierarchy. Those of higher status slept closer to fires, enjoyed thicker bedding, or were assigned to rooms with fewer drafts. Meanwhile, lower servants rotated through winter shifts, their teeth occasionally chattering as they performed nighttime duties. You imagine their breath puffing out in faint clouds as they waited quietly, eyes fixed on the king's curtains, listening for any sign that he needed assistance. You move toward a narrow stool near the foot of the bed. Your palm rests on it lightly. This spot, close to the monarch yet still outside the curtain enclosure, was sometimes reserved for a favored guard or body servant who slept lightly and remained alert. He might be given a small fur cloak or a thin blanket, but rarely anything beyond the essentials. To be in this position was an honor, yet even honor did not warm the bones. These attendants braved the cold for the sake of loyalty, their comfort sacrificed for the king's safety. You turn your head slightly, imagining the way torchlight once flickered across their faces. Their noses reddened, their fingers wrapped around themselves for warmth, their boots pressed against cold stone. Sometimes, to steal a little relief, they edged closer to the hearth when they thought no one was watching. A few household documents note reprimands given to guards caught lingering too near the king's fire. Heat was precious. It was not to be taken freely. As you step across the chamber, you spot a patch of wall where a tapestry once hung. Only faint marks remain, but you sense its former presence. That fabric warmed the room in two ways. It blocked drafts for the king, and it displayed wealth. Tapestries woven with gold thread or depicting noble lineage signaled power, and power translated into warmth. In the medieval imagination, a cold room belonged to the lowly. Heat belonged to the noble. The king's chamber embodied that idea with bold clarity. In the corner, you notice a small wooden screen. This object, simple yet important, might have shielded lesser servants from the king's view. It also blocked some of the cold. You lift it slightly, feeling its weight. The design is plain, almost humble, yet its presence hints at the strict choreography of space. The king slept in warmth because others absorbed the cold. Comfort in this room was not evenly shared. It was distributed according to proximity to power. You pause, letting that realization settle into your senses. A curious reference appears in a courtier's letters from a northern kingdom. He described how stepping into the king's bedchamber felt like entering a different climate compared to the rest of the castle. Yet even inside this supposedly warmer space, only the immediate radius around the bed reached tolerable temperatures. The surrounding area remained so cold that ink froze in inkwells during harsh winters. You step closer to the window slit and place your hand near its edge. The air here is freezing, almost sharp. You draw your hand back instinctively. It surprises you how quickly cold becomes unbearable. But now imagine a low-ranking servant stationed here for hours, expected to remain silent and alert while the king dozed behind thick curtains. That was the reality of status in winter. The king's warmth came at the price of someone else's discomfort. Turning away from the window, you picture the subtle body language of the people in this chamber, the way they huddled discreetly to conserve heat, the way they held their fingers close to small candles for a moment of fleeting warmth, the way they shifted weight from one foot to the other to keep numbness at bay. They could not complain. They could not request thicker blankets or extra logs. The social order wrapped around them as tightly as the king's fur-lined covers wrapped around him. You walk once more past the tapestry marks and rest your hand against the cold stone. A soft hum of wandering thought passes through your mind. While modern listeners think of royalty as enjoying endless comfort, the reality was more nuanced. The king did have warmth, but it was orchestrated warmth, dependent on dozens of people performing silent tasks. Everyone else in the room lived in varying degrees of cold. Some historical accounts hint that the difference in temperature between a king's bed and the surrounding chamber could feel almost symbolic. Warmth meant authority, cold meant obligation. Your steps carry you back toward the center of the room, where the temperature feels less brutal. From here, you imagine the king lying behind the curtains, half asleep, breathing steadily, unaware of the cold gripping the rest of the chamber. The attendants watched him with quiet devotion, sometimes fighting sleep themselves, sometimes silently praying that dawn would come soon so they could escape to the lower quarters where at least the body heat of many servants gathered in one place provided a crude sense of warmth. You take a slow breath, letting the air whisper into your chest. The silence here is deep, almost ceremonial. You sense the delicate balance the king's household maintained each night. His comfort relied on a web of social roles, all arranged carefully according to rank, obedience, and loyalty. As you turn your head, your attention naturally falls toward another detail of winter survival, what the king actually wore to bed. After all, external warmth was only half the story. The other half rested on the garments he pulled close to his skin before slipping between the layers. With a gentle step, you begin to move toward the small chest holding those garments, ready to discover what nightwear truly meant for a medieval monarch. You walk toward the low wooden chest near the inner wall, its surface dulled by age, its iron fittings cold beneath your touch. When you lift the lid, a faint sigh of chilled air escapes, brushing your face like a subtle reminder that even clothing stored indoors could feel icy in winter. Inside, folded carefully, lies the king's nightwear. At first glance, the garments appear simple, but when you lift one by the shoulders, the fabric reveals its purpose instantly. It is heavier than you expect, thicker, designed to seal warmth close to the skin. You run your fingertips across the linen. The weave feels tight, dense, nothing like the airy material used for summer. A great deal of historical wardrobe evidence points out that winter linens for the upper classes were often deliberately crafted from finer, warmer flax, beaten soft through repeated washings. The result was a garment that hugged the body without scratching, a crucial comfort when the cold crept relentlessly through stone. You hold the nightshirt up toward the faint candle light, observing its length. It falls nearly to the calf. Medieval kings did not sleep in short, tidy garments. They needed coverage. The oversized cut allowed for movement under blankets while still trapping warm air around the torso and legs. Some garments even included small ties or inner gussets to keep them from shifting excessively during sleep. You imagine the king sliding into one of these long shirts, the cool touch of linen making him shudder at first, only to warm gradually as his body heat seeped into the fabric. As you set the nightshirt aside, your hand brushes another folded layer beneath it, and you pull out a padded jacket. It resembles a soft doublet, stuffed lightly with wool. One intriguing detail from textile specialists notes that padding served not only to warm, but also to mimic the comforting pressure of heavy bedding for nobles accustomed to travel. When a king found himself in a draftier residence, the padded layer offered a portable bit of reassurance. You hold it to your chest and feel its gentle weight. It is not thick enough to overheat, but substantial enough to guard the king's core warmth. Next, you uncover a pair of woolen hose. They would have reached up the leg and tied at the waist beneath the nightshirt. The wool is surprisingly soft, showing that only the highest quality fibers touched royal skin at night. You slide your hand inside one leg and feel how quickly the fabric warms with contact. Imagine the king, one foot slipping into the cold wool, suppressing a grunt of discomfort, and then gradually relaxing as heat gathers. These hose were essential. Without them, even the thick blankets and heavy bed curtains could not fully prevent the sharp sting of cold against bare legs. Beneath the hose lies a fur-lined nightcap. You lift it gently, its interior brushed with some long softened pelt. Warmth escapes through the head faster than through most of the body, so despite their regal pride, many kings wore caps to bed. Surviving illustrations of royal bedchambers often depict monarchs with soft caps tied loosely beneath the chin. It is a strangely endearing image, not majestic, not intimidating, just practical. A ruler tucking himself in like any other human trying to survive winter. You slip the cap over your hand and imagine the sensation it once offered, that immediate relief as the fur hugged the scalp, shielding the king from the cold drafts swirling overhead. You are struck by the tenderness of the idea. A head covering seems so small, yet it played a crucial role in preserving body heat. Small comforts often meant the difference between restful sleep and a miserable night. You return the cap to the chest and pick up a small cloth bundle tucked neatly into a corner. When you unfold it, you find soft, fingerless gloves. They appear humble, perhaps even odd by modern standards, yet they served an important purpose. The king sometimes read or signed documents in bed during winter evenings. These gloves kept his hands warm enough to hold a quill without trembling. The fingertips remained uncovered to allow precision. In a world where cold ink stiffened quickly and parchment cracked easily, steady hands mattered. An unexpected note found in the writings of a royal physician mentions that warm extremities were believed to protect a sleeper from harmful night vapors. Whether true or not, the belief shaped bedtime customs. You picture the king tugging these gloves on as the fire flickered low, his breath soft in the dim chamber, the fabric helping him cling to whatever warmth he could steal from the night. You settle onto the stool beside the chest, letting the garments drape across your lap. As you adjust the linen folds, you sense how thoughtfully these clothes were engineered for both comfort and dignity. Even in the privacy of his chamber, a king could not collapse into sleep without ritual. Nightwear expressed status just as daywear did. Rich dye on the edges, embroidered seams or imported fabric all hinted at wealth. You run your thumb along one carefully stitched hem and feel the intricacy of the work. Someone poured hours into a garment only a handful of people would ever see. You lift the padded jacket again and fold it slowly, imagining the nightly routine that once took place here. The king stood near the fire, attendants holding out each layer. First the linen, then the hose, then the padded garment, then the cap. The process resembled armor dressing in reverse, exchanging weight and rigidity for softness and heat. Yet the symbolic meaning remained. These clothes protected him through the long hours of vulnerability when he was no longer alert, no longer guarded by conscious thought. Warmth became its own kind of shield. As you place each item back inside the chest, the quiet of the room deepens. Your mind lingers on how much preparation these garments required. Laundresses mended tears and replaced worn patches. Tailors refitted pieces when kings gained or lost weight. Fabric had to be aired but not left too long in the cold. Everything demanded careful timing. These nightclothes were far from simple. They were part of an elaborate system crafted to help a monarch sleep safely in unforgiving winters. You close the chest gently. The soft thud echoes through the chamber, reminding you that warmth was not just found in thick blankets or blazing hearths. It lived in small details too. The pressing of fabric against skin, the ease of movement beneath heavy coverings, the delicate warmth preserved inside a fur-lined cap. You straighten, allowing your gaze to shift toward the bed once more. You picture the king now fully dressed for sleep, layers wrapped around him, cap tied loosely, gloves ready if needed. He approaches the bed, his steps deliberate, the preparation complete. But his night was not yet fully secured. As warm as the garments were, they needed help from other tools. Objects heated with fire, devices slid between the sheets. Quiet methods, both clever and risky, used to keep the cold from stealing away those first fragile moments of rest. Your eyes drift naturally toward the side table where those warming tools once waited. You move toward the small bedside table, its surface covered in faint scorch marks that hint at countless winter nights. When you place your palm upon it, the wood feels cool and slightly rough, carrying the quiet history of objects once warmed by fire. You imagine servants crowding around this very spot, preparing implements intended to chase away the cold long before the king slipped into bed. Your fingers brush the curved handle of a metal warming pan. The lid is wide and shallow, its hinges stiff with age. You lift it carefully, noticing how the interior still holds the faint scent of charcoal long extinguished. In the medieval world, this pan played a practical and slightly nerve-wracking role. Servants filled it with glowing embers from the hearth, closed the lid tightly, and then slid it gently between the layers of bedding to heat the sheets. A well-preserved household account mentions that warming pans were used even in rooms with substantial fires, because bedding absorbed cold far more stubbornly than air. You visualize the process. A servant, gloved and cautious, carrying the pan by its long handle, the metal popping faintly as it adjusted to sudden heat. The servant would slip it beneath the blankets, moving it in slow, circular motions to avoid scorching the mattress. The idea seems simple, yet the risks were real. Beds sometimes caught fire when a pan rested too long in one place. One servant in a royal household reportedly faced severe punishment after singeing the king's fur quilt, a reminder that warmth demanded constant vigilance. One servant in a royal household reportedly faced severe punishment after singeing the king's fur quilt, a reminder that warmth demanded constant vigilance. You visualize the process. A servant, gloved and cautious, carrying the pan by its long handle, the metal popping faintly as it adjusted to sudden heat. The servant would slip it beneath the blankets, moving it in slow, circular motions to avoid scorching the mattress. The idea seems simple, yet the risks were real. Beds sometimes caught fire when a pan rested too long in one place. You set the pan down gently and reach for another device. A small wooden frame holding a thick cloth sack. Inside, stones heated by the fire would radiate warmth for hours. The cloth feels rough under your fingertips, and you imagine how it once trapped the warmth, releasing it steadily through long winter nights. An interesting comment appears in an old steward's ledger that hot stones were favored for travel, as they were safer and easier to carry between chambers. You lift the sack slightly and picture the king sliding his feet against it beneath the blankets. The stones would warm his legs, easing stiff joints and calming the lingering ache that days of riding or cold drafts could leave behind. Though simple, this method left a deep impression on those who experienced it. Nearby lies a small brass pot with a lid that clicks softly when you tap it. It once held heated water. The pot's rounded belly fits perfectly between your hands, and you sense how soothing it must have been for the king to press it against his stomach or hold it near his chest. Some late medieval physicians recommended warm water vessels to stimulate digestion and promote relaxation. Whether their medical reasoning was sound or not, the soothing heat likely felt luxurious in the frigid chamber. You close your eyes briefly and imagine the room alive with warmth-based preparations. Servants moving items from table to bed with careful choreography. Someone shaking out the blankets. Someone testing the temperature of the sheets with cautious fingers. Someone checking that embers inside the warming pan glowed but did not flame. These preparations took time. The king never simply walked into his chamber and slept. Warmth had to be coaxed, curated, almost negotiated with the cold. Your gaze shifts toward a pair of small iron cups resting beside the pot. Their flat bottoms and narrow openings suggest they once held buzzing coals placed specifically under footstools or near the king's legs before he entered bed. Not as hot as an open pan, not as gentle as hot stones. These tiny braziers provided focused warmth. A surviving description from a court visitor marvels at how the king's feet never touched cold ground because attendants positioned heated objects along his path. You pick up one of the cups. The metal is smooth yet thick, built to endure repeated heating. You imagine the faint glow that once radiated from it, illuminating the king's nightclothes in soft orange. Even so, such tools came with hazards. A careless movement could tip one over. A stray spark could leap unexpectedly. Experts today note differing opinions about how common accidents truly were, as records often mention disasters only when they involved high-ranking individuals. Whatever the truth, you can sense the underlying caution that must have hung in the air each night. You lower the cup and look at the entire collection of warming devices. Together, they represent a world where surviving winter inside a stone castle demanded creativity. Fire alone could not shield a sleeper from the cold. Heat had to be carried, stored, tucked into corners, slipped beneath covers, and placed strategically around the room. Without these tools, even the king's bed would have felt like a glacier at night. You return your hand to the warming pan one more time. You imagine the soft scraping sound of metal sliding beneath blankets, the faint crackle of live embers trapped inside, the cautious eyes of the servant who guided it. You can almost feel the mix of pride and fear in that task. Warm the bed perfectly, the king sleeps well. Make one mistake, and the monarch could wake to disaster. You set the pan down carefully and straighten your posture. As you look toward the bed again, the thought settles quietly in your chest. The king's warmth did not come from a single source. It came from layers of effort, from tools both brilliant and risky, from hands that shaped every detail of his rest. Your gaze drifts naturally from the devices on the table toward the far corner of the chamber, where another method of holding warmth quietly waits. A more ancient method. A method rooted not in fire or metal but in the earth itself. With quiet steps, you begin walking toward the warm memory of heated stones resting in the shadows. You make your way toward the far corner of the chamber where a low shelf sits tucked beneath an arch of stone. The air feels colder here, untouched by fire or human breath. Yet the objects before you carry the quiet memory of warmth drawn from the earth itself. You kneel slowly, letting your fingers glide over several smooth, rounded stones, arranged neatly as if awaiting their next use. They are ordinary in appearance, but your fingertips sense faint stories in their cool surfaces. You pick up one stone. It is heavy enough to rest solidly in your palm, its edges softened by time and repeated heating. Long before metal warming pans became widespread, heated stones were one of the most reliable tools available. Household records from various castles mention that stones were placed near the hearth until they glowed with inner warmth, then wrapped in cloth and set beneath the covers to create a lasting pocket of heat. As you cradle the stone in your hand, you feel its chill giving way slightly beneath your touch, hinting at how quickly these stones once radiated comfort after absorbing fire's energy. You turn the stone gently. It fits the shape of your hand in a satisfying way. This simplicity is what made them beloved. Stones were abundant. They held heat for a long time. They posed fewer risks than ember-filled pans, and they could be moved quietly, allowing attendants to adjust the king's bedding with almost no noise. One curious observation found in a castle steward's notes describes how certain stones were favored over others for their ability to retain heat. Some households even gave them nicknames, treating them almost like trusted companions during winter. You place the stone back on the shelf and lift another, slightly larger. Its surface is smoother, as if polished by years of cloth wrappings. When you hold it close, your mind drifts to the moment it would have been pulled from the fire, glowing faintly, releasing wisps of steam from moisture trapped inside, making that soft crackling sound that signals heat spreading through its core. A servant would have handled it with thick gloves, transferring it quickly to a wool cloth or fur pouch, then hurrying to the bed so the warmth would not fade before reaching the monarch. You imagine the king lying beneath his heavy blankets, as servants slipped warmed stones near his feet, along his sides, or even under the mattress. This slow release of heat must have felt profoundly soothing. Instead of sharp warmth or unpredictable sparks, stones provided a stable, gentle radiance that encouraged deep rest. Several researchers writing about medieval household management mention ongoing discussions about how long stones could maintain their warmth. Estimates vary wildly depending on the type of rock and how it was used, which only adds to the quiet mystery of this ancient technique. You reach for a cloth lying beside the stones. It is frayed at the corners now, but once it would have been thick, perhaps lined with wool. You fold it once, twice, feeling how it would have insulated the stone just enough to prevent burns while still allowing warmth to radiate outward. Imagine the king shifting slightly in his sleep, brushing his leg against the wrapped stone, feeling that comforting glow seep into his muscles. The warmth would fade slowly through the night, but its presence made those first hours of rest far more bearable. You return the cloth to its place and study the variety of stones. Some are small, perfect for placing near hands or feet. Others are broad, ideal for tucking near the hips or lower back. A few have pale scorch marks where the fire once kissed them too closely. Each carries a fragment of winter's story. You can almost sense the hands that selected them from riverbeds or village fields, plain objects raised to royal purpose through sheer practicality. You lift a notably flat stone and press it gently against your palm. In the cold room, even its lingering chill feels grounding. You picture the king on particularly harsh nights asking for multiple stones. Attendants would rush to reheat those that had cooled. For a monarch battling the stiffness of age or the aches of warfare, warm stones offered relief modern heating rarely replicates. The pressure and weight added a kind of physical reassurance that soothed restlessness. A soft gust of wind leaks through a tiny crack in the wall, brushing past your cheek. The contrast between the cold air and your imagined warmth makes you more aware of how desperately these stones were needed. Without them, the bed would have remained an icy cradle, impossible to settle into. Fire alone could never heat the mattress. Layers alone could not conquer the chill. Stones bridged that gap, giving the bed a heartbeat of warmth drawn directly from the hearth. You place the stone on the shelf again and notice a small wooden bowl beside it. Inside are fragments of herbs, lavender, thyme, a hint of chamomile. Though now dry and colourless, they once scented the cloths that held the stones, creating soft aromas that mingled with warmth. One surviving household recipe even recommends rubbing a heated stone with herbs to release fragrance as it cooled. Whether for comfort, superstition, or simple pleasure, this practice added a tender human touch to winter nights. As you stand, you let your eyes travel slowly across the shelf one last time. The stones rest quietly, yet they carry a kind of humble dignity. They serve not by brilliance or complexity, but by endurance. They were steady companions in the long winter struggle, relied upon by rich and poor alike. You straighten your posture, feeling the faint ache that comes from kneeling on cold stone. As you step away, your gaze drifts toward the foot of the bed. The king did not rely only on the warmth of stones or blankets. He had specialized tools designed just for his feet, tools crafted to protect the most delicate extremities from the gnawing cold. You walk softly in that direction, ready to explore the clever ways medieval royalty defended their feet from winter's bite. You follow the faint chill settling around your ankles as you approach the foot of the royal bed. In winter, the cold rises from the floor like an unseen tide, creeping steadily upward until it reaches the toes, that most vulnerable part of the body. The king may have been wrapped in thick blankets and warmed by stones, yet if his feet froze, comfort evaporated instantly. Medieval people understood this deeply. So they invented small, clever ways to defend the extremities from the cold that seeped relentlessly through stone floors. You crouch near a low chest positioned at the bed's foot. When you open it, the hinges creak softly, their sound sharp against the quiet chamber. Inside lies a collection of objects that tell a story of inventive winter survival. The first item you lift is a pair of small wooden foot warmers. Each looks like a simple box with slatted openings on top. You turn one in your hands, feeling its lightness. Attendants once filled these warmers with glowing coals, then placed them beneath the bedcovers near the king's feet. As long as the embers stayed contained and the lid remained shut, the device offered a gentle, lasting heat without the danger of open flame. You set the warmer aside and trace the outline of soot that still clings to the slats. An old royal inventory mentions that these warmers were checked frequently through the night. Embers cooled, and servants slipped in silently to refresh them. A small ritual repeated over and over until morning. Without this vigilance, even the warmest bedding could not shield the king from the icy draught that crept under the bed frame. Next you lift a pair of fur-lined foot boots. They are soft, flexible, and shaped almost like modern slippers, though taller and thicker. Their inner lining still carries a faint sense of gentle fluff when you slide your fingers inside. These boots were essential for traveling kings who slept in unfamiliar chambers where drafts came from unpredictable directions. One preserved piece of correspondence between royal attendants describes how the king insisted on wearing these boots even in bed during midwinter stays in mountainous regions. The idea seems humorous at first, but when you feel the interior warmth of the boots against your fingers, you understand the logic instantly. You place the boots beside the warmer and reach again into the chest. This time, you lift a pair of knitted socks. They are made of dense wool, the kind that traps heat even when damp. A note from a medieval wardrobe roll explains that royal socks were often doubled during winter, meaning the king wore 2 layers at once. You imagine him sitting at the bedside, pulling them on with a tired sigh, the first layer prickling slightly before it softened, the second adding weight and protection. With each layer, the cold receded a little more. You hold one sock near your cheek for a moment, feeling its coolness slowly respond to your skin. It strikes you that warmth in medieval times relied heavily on insulation rather than direct heat. Keep the cold out, trap whatever warmth you produce, and survive until morning. These socks embodied that philosophy. They may not have seemed luxurious, yet they were crafted with royal precision. Thicker knitting near the toes, reinforced heels, ribbing that held snugly without cutting off circulation. As you place the socks down, your hand brushes a small leather pouch containing herb mixtures. When you open it, the faint scent of crushed juniper and marjoram escapes, surprisingly persistent after centuries. These herbs were sometimes tucked into foot warmers or rubbed on the inside of boots. A reference found in an old herbal manuscript suggests that warm scents were believed to improve circulation. Whether or not that idea held scientific merit, the combination of heat and fragrance surely comforted the king as he settled into bed, his feet wrapped in layers of fabric, fur, and heated tools. You sit for a moment on the edge of the bed and imagine the nightly choreography. A servant positions the foot warmer beneath the blankets. Another helps the king slip into his fur boots or thick socks. A third tugs the blankets downward, sealing in heat around the legs. All this care for something as small as feet tells you how real the cold was in these chambers. The chill did not simply inconvenience, it tormented. And if a king's feet grew numb in the night, he might lose sleep or wake with stiffness that affected his duties the next day. You lean forward and slip your own hand beneath the covers, picturing the warmth that once gathered at this very spot. The air beneath the blankets feels slightly insulated, even now. Imagine it filled with gentle heat from coals below, the comforting pressure of blankets above, and the soft embrace of wool around the toes. In that pocket of warmth, the king found a small refuge from winter's grip. You stand again and regard the items spread across the chest. Foot warmers, fur boots, heavy socks, herbs. They create a quiet picture of medieval innovation. Not grand inventions, not extravagant luxuries, just practical solutions, shaped by centuries of cold nights in stone-built halls. Your gaze shifts toward the side of the room where the torchlight flickers faintly against the walls. It reminds you that warmth did not come alone. It arrived partnered with scent, smoke, and lingering after-effects of burning fuel, each influencing the atmosphere of the king's chamber in ways both pleasant and suffocating. You take a soft step in that direction, ready to explore the strange mixture of smells, smoke, and winter air that enveloped a medieval king when he tried to sleep. You move toward the darker side of the chamber, where the smell of old soot lingers faintly in the air, blending with the earthy scent of stone. As you take a slow breath, you notice how the atmosphere shifts. Medieval warmth always came with a companion: smoke. Even in a royal bedchamber, the air was never perfectly clean. It carried traces of burning wood, scattered herbs, damp wool, and the faint human presence of servants slipping in and out through the night. You pause near the fireplace again. Its interior is blackened, cracked in places from centuries of heat, and as you stand before it, the ghost of old smoke rises in your imagination. Castle fires rarely burned without incident. They hissed, they spat, and they filled the room with a hazy film that clung to clothing and hair. Many chronicles mention how even well-designed chimneys could draw poorly on windy nights, causing smoke to billow straight into the chamber. You can imagine the king coughing softly, waving a hand to clear the air while attendants scrambled to adjust dampers or reposition the logs. You take a soft step in that direction, ready to explore the strange mixture of smells, smoke, and winter air that enveloped a medieval king when he tried to sleep. As you place the socks down, your hand brushes a small leather pouch containing herb mixtures. When you open it, the faint scent of crushed juniper and marjoram escapes, surprisingly persistent after centuries. These herbs were sometimes tucked into foot warmers or rubbed on the inside of boots. A reference found in an old herbal manuscript suggests that warm scents were believed to improve circulation. You step closer to the center of the chamber, where a faint draft brushes your neck. It carries the clean bite of winter air mixed with a hint of damp stone, reminding you that even with a roaring fire, the cold always found its way inside. This ever-present mixture of fresh cold and smoky warmth made the air complex, layered. A modern visitor might cough or wrinkle their nose, yet to those who lived here this was simply the smell of survival. As you walk toward the bed again, a subtle sweetness catches your attention. You follow it to a small ceramic bowl sitting on a side table. Inside lie the dried remains of herbs once used to freshen the air. Lavender, rose petals, mint, maybe a pinch of rosemary. Household accounts from high-status residences frequently mention such mixtures, not only for fragrance but also for the belief that certain scents protected sleepers from illness. You crumble a fragment between your fingers. It releases a ghost of its former aroma, soft and soothing, the kind of scent that might calm a restless mind on a bitter night. You lift the bowl slightly and imagine a servant sprinkling herbs around the bed before drawing the curtains closed. The fragrance would have risen slowly, warmed by the king's body heat, blending with the lingering smoke from the hearth. Together they created a unique atmosphere, part comfort, part caution. Medieval physicians often warned that too much smoke weakened the body, yet they recommended burning specific herbs to cleanse the air. Competing beliefs shaped nightly routines, creating a curious balance between pleasure and practicality. A quiet memory recorded in the notebook of a traveling courtier recounts how, on especially cold nights, the room filled with a thick mixture of pine smoke and damp wool. According to his words, it made the room feel alive and breathing, as though the walls themselves exhaled warmth. You imagine the scent hugging the king, clinging to his hair and clothes. Even after morning arrived, the smell would linger on his garments as he walked through the hallways. You turn toward the window slit where a faint pulse of icy air seeps through. The cold outside mixes with the warm interior, creating a swirling current that stirs the scents of the room. Close your eyes for a moment. You can almost hear the crack of burning firewood, feel the sting of smoke in your nose, and sense the warmth hovering just out of reach. A thin thread of winter wind snakes around you, pulling the scents of the chamber into motion. Leather, fur, charcoal, fragrant herbs, and the muted musk of bundled textiles. This was the sensory experience of medieval sleep, nothing sterile, nothing neutral. A tapestry of smells that reflected daily life, some comforting, some unpleasant, all inescapable. You walk slowly back toward the bed, letting your fingers skim the familiar fabric. You picture the king breathing deeply within his curtain-enclosed nest, inhaling the mingled odors of warmth and winter. These smells told him he was protected. They also reminded him of the cold lurking beyond the curtains. Your gaze shifts now to the other presence that often filled these chambers at night. People. The king did not always sleep alone. Whether for security, warmth, or companionship, others sometimes shared the space, and their presence added another layer to the nights. You draw a breath and begin to step toward the area where guards or companions once kept quiet, watch, ready to explore the human company that shaped the king's winter sleep. You drift toward the shadowed end of the chamber, where a long bench sits close to the wall, its surface worn smooth by bodies that spent many nights lingering here. As you approach, you feel the subtle shift of the room's energy, the echo of human presence lingering like a soft imprint in the air. A king, no matter how powerful, did not always sleep alone. In winter especially, warmth and security wove themselves together, and the quiet company of others often shaped the night far more than solitude ever could. You rest your hand on the bench, The cold sinks into your palm instantly. Imagine a guard sitting here hours at a time, his back straight, eyes alert, breath rising in pale clouds when the fire burned low. Some chronicles describe kings whose most trusted guards slept inside their chambers, positioned just far enough from the bed to offer protection, yet close enough to hear any disturbance. Their presence was both a shield and a sacrifice. These men braved the worst of the cold while ensuring that the king slept without fear. You picture one such guard, wrapped in a heavy cloak, trying not to shift too loudly as he fought off drowsiness. The room is dim. The only movement comes from the curtains around the king's bed, swaying gently in a passing draught. The guard listens to every sound, the faint pop of an ember, the sigh of the wind, the quiet breathing from behind the curtains. One historian's descriptive account of royal night routines notes that these guards often served in rotating pairs so at least one remained fully awake, especially during harsh winters when strange noises echoed through the corridors. You step away from the bench and approach a small pallet of folded cloth on the floor. It is thin and unpadded, little more than layered blankets. A favoured attendant might have slept here, close enough to respond to the king's requests, yet far from the comfort of the royal bed. You kneel beside the pallet, feeling its rough texture beneath your fingertips. One interesting mention in a household ledger describes young noble pages sleeping nearby during winter, not only for service but to add extra body heat to the room. Their presence helped warm the chamber, a quiet reminder that even kings benefited from human warmth long before science explained how much heat a single person gives off. You sit back and let your gaze travel along the chamber's perimeter. You can almost see the silhouettes of these figures in the dimness. A guard leaning on his spear, a page curled under a blanket, a maidservant retreating after her final duty. Each brought warmth, breath, and life into the chamber. Medieval sleep, especially in winter, rarely meant isolation. Privacy held a different meaning in those centuries. To share a room, or even a bed, with attendants or companions was normal, practical, expected. You rise and walk toward the right side of the chamber, where a low chair sits angled toward the bed. Its position suggests conversation. Companions sometimes spent time with the king in the quiet hours before sleep, sharing stories, reading passages aloud or offering counsel. A surviving letter written by a courtier speaks of winter evenings when the king invited a trusted friend to sit beside him while the fire glowed low. They spoke softly about matters of the kingdom or, occasionally, about nothing important at all. The cold outside made such closeness feel necessary, even grounding. You touch the back of the chair. The wood feels cold but sturdy. You imagine the warm presence of two voices drifting through the curtains, murmuring in the dark. The king's deep tones softened by fatigue. The companion's words weaving lightly through the chamber. Human company warmed the night in more ways than any stone or fur blanket could. You step toward the curtains again. Their weight seems to divide the room into two worlds, the intimate world of the king and the outer ring of watchers and helpers. Even when the curtains were closed, he could hear the faint rustlings of those outside, the steady rhythm of another person's breathing, the occasional shift of boots on stone. These quiet signs of life offered reassurance against the loneliness that winter often intensified. A small, almost tender insight from a medieval diary recounts that some kings felt uneasy, sleeping without attendants nearby during storms. The sounds of howling wind, rattling shutters, and distant thunder felt less threatening when shared. Company made the cold seem less hostile. Even silence held comfort when someone else occupied the same room. You run your hand across the thick rug beneath your feet and picture the muted footsteps of people moving softly around the chamber. The king might never fully open his eyes, but he sensed their presence. It was a kind of invisible cocoon, a human circle guarding both his body and his sleep. As you continue walking, You notice how this interplay of warmth, companionship, and vigilance shaped the night. These others did not share the king's comfort, but their nearness enriched his rest. Not through luxury, but through the simple power of human presence. Your footsteps carry you toward the wall where a tapestry once hung. You rest your fingers against the cold stone and allow your mind to shift toward the very bones of this place. The building itself played a role in warming the king. Thick walls, narrow windows, stone designed for survival more than comfort. Slowly, you turn toward the architectural heart of the story, ready to step into the world of design choices that shaped warmth in a medieval castle. You walk toward the nearest wall, letting your fingertips glide across its surface. The stone is colder than anything you have touched in this chamber so far, almost painfully so, as if it carries the memory of 1,000 winters within it. In this moment you understand something essential. The very architecture of a medieval castle shaped the king's experience of warmth. Nothing here was designed for comfort. Everything was built for defense first, survival second, and only much later for a hint of homely ease. Yet these same features that guarded against invaders also determined how heat behaved in the king's chamber. You step back and study the wall from a slight distance. It is thick, far thicker than any modern house wall. This mass provided excellent protection against attacks, but it also absorbed cold like a sponge. One commonly noted architectural detail from the period is that castle walls could be up to 10 feet thick in major fortifications. Imagine the sheer volume of icy stone pressing inward on every room. Even the king's chamber, elevated high above the draftiest floors, fought a constant battle against this silent weight of cold. As you continue walking, your boots echo softly. The sound fills the vast space of the room, reminding you that high ceilings were another hallmark of medieval construction. They created grandeur, yes, but they also allowed warm air to rise far above the heads of those trying to sleep. You tilt your head back and look upward. The ceiling stretches into a dim vault where warmth would have gathered uselessly, never reaching the people who needed it most. Specialists in medieval architecture often remark that the king enjoyed the warmest spot in the room only if he stood near the fire or nestled inside his heavily curtained bed. Everywhere else, warmth drifted away into the heights. Your eyes shift toward the window slit on the opposite wall. Narrow, tall, and deeply recessed, it was designed for defense. The thick embrasure allowed archers a protected position to shoot from, while the tiny opening minimized vulnerability. Yet this same design funneled cold air inside, like the mouth of a winter cave. You place your hand on the stone frame. The air leaking through feels thin but sharp. Even with shutters or oiled cloth stretched across the opening, drafts sneaked in. A fragment from an old building account mentions repairs ordered each winter to block cracks around the king's windows, but nothing could stop the cold completely. The architecture permitted survival, not comfort. You kneel to inspect the floor. Stone again, hard, unyielding, and frigid enough to steal heat from any bare foot. You press your palm against it and pull back instinctively. To combat this, thick rugs and woven mats covered the chamber floors, especially in royal rooms. These textiles provided insulation, but even the finest rugs could not transform the stone beneath. A curious detail recorded by a visiting envoy describes how stepping off the king's rug onto the bare floor felt like plunging one's foot into icy water. You can almost feel that contrast now as you rise again. You walk toward the bed, studying how it seems almost out of place against the harsh geometry of stone. The bed, canopy, curtains, and layered blankets served as a kind of architectural countermeasure. Where the building failed to hold warmth, the bedding succeeded by creating a micro-environment. You run your hand along the bedpost, feeling the warm memory of the enclosed space that protected the king, while the rest of the room drifted on the edge of freezing. Your steps bring you toward the corner where two massive walls meet, Their thickness creates a hollow, echoing hush, as if even sound struggles to penetrate the stone. People who lived in these structures often commented that winter inside a castle felt like winter in a cavern. You place your palm against the surface again, and the cold radiates into your hand so intensely that it almost numbs your fingertips. This was the reality behind the grandeur. The king's chamber might have held tapestries, carved furniture, and costly fabrics, but at its core it remained a fortified room made of unyielding stone. You imagine the masons who built this place centuries ago. Their priority was stability, strength, strategic advantage. They carved narrow windows to prevent enemy arrows. They made ceilings lofty to disperse smoke and allow gatherings. They layered stone upon stone until walls became mountains. Heat barely registered in their design philosophy. Yet the king, sleeping inside the result of their labor, had to endure their choices every winter night. A soft whisper of wind slides across your cheek, reminding you that air moves unpredictably in a building like this. Thick walls created temperature pockets, trapping heat in some corners and funneling cold through others. Some accounts from the era describe people choosing sleeping positions based on where the stone allowed the least draft. Even kings sometimes shifted their bed placement seasonally, moving closer to an interior wall in winter and nearer to a window in summer. You walk toward one such interior wall and press your ear against it. The stone is quieter here, less exposed to external elements. Rooms built along interior corridors were prized for their relative warmth, which makes it significant that the king's chamber occupies a place both strategic and practical. Balancing security and comfort was part of the building's logic. Your gaze travels up the wall again to the beams supporting the ceiling. Although rarely visible beneath plaster, these beams had their own effect on warmth. Wooden framing, when present, held heat far better than stone. But the king's room, designed for grandeur, often featured minimal wood in its walls. Insulation, as we understand it, did not exist. Every object in the room had to fight against the architectural cold. You exhale slowly, feeling a subtle shiver trace your spine. The air around you carries the same chill the king once experienced. Despite fires, curtains, furs, and warming tools, the room never achieved true warmth. Instead, the king dwelled in an equilibrium between cold walls and warm pockets of human ingenuity. You take another slow step back, letting the scale of the chamber settle around you. Architecture created the problem. Human creativity produced the solutions. Yet one more battle waited just outside your awareness. The drafts themselves, invisible, persistent, slipping through cracks and seams like winter ghosts. You turn your body slightly toward the hanging tapestries and doorways where those drafts once crept in, ready to explore how the king's household waged war against the constant arrival of icy air. You turn slowly toward the places in the room where cold once crept in like a living thing, slipping through cracks with the patience of a thief. A medieval castle could feel as if it breathed in winter, inhaling icy air through joints in the stone, and releasing it in thin, chilling draughts that slithered across the floor. Even a king, wrapped in privilege and buried in layers, could not fully escape these invisible intruders. Every night became a quiet battle against the shifting currents of cold that moved unpredictably through the chamber. You step closer to the window embrasure. The slit itself is narrow, but the deep frame around it acts like a funnel. You place your palm in the recessed groove and immediately feel the sharp bite of air pushing through. Window shutters existed, of course, often made of thick wood or covered with oiled cloth, but they never sealed perfectly. One practical note appearing in various castle maintenance rolls explains that shutters shrank during freezing weather, pulling away from their frames and allowing even more cold to slip inside. You imagine servants stuffing bits of wool or straw into gaps, their breath fogging as they worked in the dimness. You turn away from the window and walk toward the doorway, another silent pathway for drafts. You rest your hand along the frame and feel a faint movement of air brushing the back of your fingers. Heavy doors helped, especially those lined with leather or hung with thick coverings, but even then the cold found ways to seep through. A description written by a medieval steward complains about how the king's chamber door rattled with each winter gust, allowing a steady whisper of cold to reach the floor. You imagine the faint, continuous sigh of winter leaking into the room. Near the doorway, you notice a length of tapestry hanging loosely against the wall. You touch the fabric. Even now it feels heavy, its weave dense and coarse. Tapestries served more than decorative purposes. They trapped warm air close to the walls and softened the icy exhale of stone. You lift a corner of the cloth and press your hand behind it. The temperature there is noticeably harsher, as if the wall itself breathes frost. A tapestry allowed the king and his attendants to forget, at least for a moment, how frigid the stone truly was beneath. A fascinating reference from early castle inventories notes that winter tapestries were sometimes swapped out for even heavier versions when cold months arrived. These were lined with wool or backed with leather, creating a substantial barrier. Some were so heavy that it took multiple attendants to hang them. You picture them working in the dim morning light, tugging the massive fabric into place so the king would not feel winter creeping behind his back during the night. You walk further into the chamber, letting your boots skim lightly across the floor. A sudden, almost playful flick of cold air brushes your ankle. You glance downward and realize how drafts often traveled. Low, silent, and persistent. The cold slipped under doors, slid across stone and curled upward like an unseen fog. Thick rugs slowed its advance, but could not stop it. A royal household manual from the 15th century describes placing rolled cloth or fur along the base of doors to block these floor-level gusts. You step toward the threshold and imagine the king's attendants kneeling here each evening, tucking fabric tightly against the gap. You approach one of the bed curtains and stand still for a moment. A slight movement of air rustles the lower hem, showing you precisely why the curtains mattered so much. Even if the room could not be entirely warmed, the bed could be sealed against shifting drafts. A curtain enclosure did not need perfect insulation. It only needed stability, a place where air stood still instead of swirling unpredictably. You slip inside the curtain's shadow for a moment, and the difference is immediate. The air feels quieter, calmer, more obedient. Stepping out again, you notice a small copper pot set near the wall. Its wide rim hints that it once held embers or hot sand, placed strategically to warm the area near troublesome drafts. Some contemporary accounts describe how servants moved these pots throughout the night, chasing cold pockets as they emerged. The idea seems almost theatrical, a quiet dance between servants and winter, both shaping the room's temperature in subtle ways. You lift the pot gently. Its weight is comfortable, its shape well suited for carrying. You imagine a servant padding softly through the chamber, placing heated objects near cold corners, guided not by sight but by touch and instinct. Castles taught people to sense drafts, the way a sailor senses wind shifts. A slight change in air pressure, a faint movement of a curtain hem, a whisper of cold brushing across the wrist. You place the pot back down and step to the center of the room. Here you inhale slowly, trying to feel the air as the king once did. At night, he would have sensed these cold threads moving around him, often without seeing their source. He depended on his attendants, his architecture, and his belongings to hold the cold at bay. But drafts remained persistent companions. They shaped the rhythm of the night. Sometimes they woke him. Sometimes they made him pull the blankets tighter. Sometimes they reminded him, even in the deepest warmth of his bed, that winter was always waiting just outside the curtains. You let that thought settle gently into your mind. Then you turn your attention toward another dimension of winter life inside the castle. Warmth was never just physical or architectural. It carried meaning, influence, symbolism. Cold could be used to exclude. Warmth could be used to reward. As you step away from the drifting air, your path leads naturally into the subtle politics of temperature. You walk slowly toward the center of the chamber again, letting the cold and warmth mingle around your ankles like two invisible forces circling each other. It becomes clear, as you stand in the quiet glow of the fire's memory, that temperature in a medieval castle was never merely a matter of comfort. Warmth carried meaning. Warmth signaled status. Warmth shaped loyalty. Even the king's sleep, cushioned by layers and guarded by curtains, reflected a political landscape where heat itself became an instrument of influence. You pause near the hearth, resting your hand lightly on the cool mantle. The king always stood closest to the fire. That was not simply tradition. It was a visual cue, a reminder that power resided with the one who enjoyed the heat. Several court chronicles describe the unspoken choreography around fires in royal halls. Those favored by the king stood nearer. Those who had fallen out of grace found themselves drifting toward the colder edges of the room, a quiet yet unmistakable signal of their current standing. You imagine courtiers glancing subtly at one another during gatherings, measuring their distance from the flames as carefully as their distance from the king's favor. As you take a step back, the cold immediately reclaims the space where you stood. This contrast between warm and cold was more than a physical sensation. It became a metaphor woven into daily life. One court poet wrote of a rival's misfortune as being left in the shadowed chill of the chamber, a phrase that described both literal frost and political frost in the same breath. You let that double meaning settle into the atmosphere as you glide your fingertips over the stone once more. You place the pot back down and step to the center of the room. Here you inhale slowly, trying to feel the air as the king once did. At night, he would have sensed these cold threads moving around him, often without seeing their source. He depended on his attendants, his architecture, and his belongings to hold the cold at bay. But drafts remained persistent companions. They shaped the rhythm of the night. Sometimes they woke him. Sometimes they made him pull the blankets tighter. To stand nearest the warmth of his private chamber was a privilege, not a basic task. Proximity meant significance. You walk further toward a narrow alcove, letting your hands skim the cold wall as you move. You picture a noble forced to wait there, away from the fire, perhaps due to a recent argument or political misstep. That person would feel the chill creeping into their bones as an unmistakable reminder of their diminished influence. Comfort was not distributed evenly. Temperature became a subtle language spoken through the placement of people within a space. Moving back toward the table where the warming tools remain, you pause beside the metal pan. You imagine a scenario hinted at in a late medieval anecdote. A trusted attendant tasked with warming the king's bedding might be replaced suddenly after falling out of favor. A new servant would take the position, not for competence alone, but as a sign of rising status. Even small responsibilities carried weight, because serving the king's warmth was itself an honor. You lift the handle of the warming pan for a moment and think of how such tasks were performed under watchful eyes. A servant who handled the pan well demonstrated both skill and devotion. A mishap, however, could risk a king's comfort, which in turn could jeopardize that servant's standing. The simple act of warming a bed thus carried political undercurrents. You set the pan back down gently, aware of its historical significance beyond mere heat. You step once more toward the center of the room, drawing your cloak tighter as a faint draft brushes past. In the medieval imagination, warmth was also tied to generosity. Kings who provided heated chambers during winter gatherings displayed benevolence and abundance. Those who forced their subjects to shiver in poorly heated halls risked appearing indifferent or stingy. Accounts of winter feasts often describe courtiers praising the warmth as much as the food, noting how rare and luxurious it felt to dine comfortably during bitter weather. Yet warmth could also be withheld deliberately. A few diplomatic diaries mention visiting envoys being offered colder rooms when negotiations soured, a quiet gesture meant to unsettle them, to remind them of their dependence on royal hospitality. You picture an ambassador lying awake at night, teeth chattering, wondering whether the chill was accidental or deliberate. In a world without central heating, Such gestures carried emotional weight. You turn toward the curtains of the king's bed. Their thick folds represent the ultimate expression of selective warmth. Only one person slept inside that carefully curated cocoon, while others endured the drafts outside. That contrast reinforced the hierarchy of the room. The king's body heat, protected and amplified by layers of cloth and the labor of attendants, symbolized his elevated place in the world. Those who served him, though essential to maintaining that heat, remained outside its circle. You rest your hand on the curtain and let it sway slightly. A soft rustle answers. That sound alone could have carried meaning during the night. If attendants heard the curtains move, they would be ready to assist, proving their loyalty through quick action and enduring cold. A king who pulled his curtains aside could see, even in the dim glow of embers, how his closest servants stood ready. In that moment, warmth, loyalty, and hierarchy converged into a single silent tableau. You take one slow step back and let the draft settle against your skin again. The subtle politics of temperature shaped not only the king's surroundings, but also the relationships within his court. Warmth could reward, cold could rebuke, and every winter night reflected this delicate balance without a word being spoken. Yet even in the midst of this social dance, the king's own nightly rituals continued. He had tasks to perform before sleep, routines shaped by necessity, habit, and the persistent chill of winter. You turn your gaze toward the low cabinet holding chamber implements and feel the narrative pulling you toward the king's private bedtime practices. You walk toward the low cabinet near the bed, its wooden surface darkened by age and countless winters. As your fingers skim its edge, you sense the weight of routine that once lived here. A king's bedtime was not simply lying down and drifting into sleep. It was a carefully managed sequence of small tasks, each shaped by the cold, by tradition, and by the quiet need to maintain safety and dignity in the long hours of the night. You open the cabinet gently. The hinges give a soft groan, releasing the faint scent of old oil and herbs. Inside rests a collection of objects that tell the story of midnight rituals. At first you see a chamber pot made of glazed ceramic. Its rim is slightly worn, its shape rounded and practical. You lift it with both hands, feeling the cool weight settle against your palms. Even kings needed relief during the night, and wandering through icy hallways to reach a latrine was unthinkable in the depths of winter. This pot was a necessity, always placed close to the bed and emptied at dawn by trusted attendants. You set the pot down carefully and imagine the king waking in the quiet darkness, the air frigid enough to sting his skin, the chamber still except for the soft crackling of dying embers. He would push aside the bed curtains just enough to reach for the pot. The cold that rushed in through the opening would make him move quickly, eager to return to the warm sanctuary of blankets and furs. Period accounts sometimes mention how such nighttime moments were accompanied by a servant shifting discreetly nearby, ready to assist without intruding. The balance between privacy and service was delicate, especially in winter. You reach further inside the cabinet and discover a small candle holder made of bronze. It is fitted with a finger loop and a drip pan, practical in design. You lift it, and the metal feels icy as it touches your skin. Candles were the king's guide in the middle of the night. If he woke uneasy or needed to check the fire, this small flame became both illumination and reassurance. A long tradition in royal households encouraged keeping a candle lit through the night, though only partially shielded to prevent accidents. Some observers from the period even remark on disagreements about whether a flame should burn while the king slept. Safety concerns battled superstition. Some believed the light protected the sleeper from wandering spirits or dark dreams. Others insisted that an open flame so close to heavy drapery was far too dangerous. You place the candle holder on the table beside the bed and imagine the scene. The king wakes to the faint glow of the night candle. The wax has melted into a small pool at its base. Shadows dance along the walls. He listens for sounds outside the chamber. Perhaps a distant howl of wind. Perhaps the muted steps of a guard changing position. Perhaps nothing at all but the soft whisper of cold pressing against the stone. That moment of stillness reveals how fragile warmth truly was in a castle. You inhale slowly, feeling the heaviness of that silence settle around you. Next, you lift a small pouch filled with dried herbs. Its drawstring is frayed, but the faint fragrance still rises when you squeeze the cloth. These herbs were steeped in warm wine or water and offered to the king before sleep. A calming drink eased the chill in his chest and helped quiet an anxious mind. One recorded observation from a royal physician describes brewing a concoction of warmed honey, wine, and ground herbs to steady the king's breathing during bitter winter nights. You imagine the king sipping from a cup while seated on the edge of the bed, the steam rising into his face, the warmth spreading through his body in slow waves. You set the herb pouch aside and draw out a soft cloth folded neatly beneath it. This cloth once served as a towel to wipe the king's face or hands after washing. Cold water in winter was harsh, sharp enough to make fingers ache, so warm water was brought up in small pitchers whenever possible. Many households kept a basin near the bed for quick nighttime refreshment. You run your fingers along the fabric and imagine the king dipping his hands into the warmed water, sighing quietly as the heat soothed his stiff joints. Your gaze shifts toward the fireplace where only faint traces of ash remain. You imagine the king just before lying down for the night, stepping toward the hearth, stretching his hands toward the glow, and feeling the fire's last breath of warmth against his face. A courtier's diary from centuries ago describes this moment as almost ceremonial, a final gathering of heat to carry into the heavy blankets. Afterward, attendants would bank the fire, pushing embers together to keep them smouldering through the night. The glow provided comfort and a sense of vigilance, though sometimes the room smelled sharply of dying flame. As you walk back to the bed, you lift the corner of the curtain and slip into the enclosed space. The air feels denser here, more private. You sit on the edge of the mattress and picture the king settling himself into this confined warmth. He would adjust his pillows, pull the blankets close, and tuck his feet near whichever warming device had been placed for him. Before closing the curtains fully, he might glance toward the darkened corners of the room to ensure the guards were present, their silhouettes faint but steady. You imagine one last task the king often performed. He listened, for sounds of the castle settling, for gusts of wind striking the shutters, for the drip of melting snow somewhere deep in the roof beams, for footsteps belonging to guards patrolling the corridors, sound-shaped medieval nights as much as cold did. It reassured, it warned, it kept the king attuned to the living presence of his household. A note from a chronicler describes a king who claimed he slept better when he heard whispered movement outside his bed curtains because it reminded him that he was protected. You lean back slightly, letting the curtains sway against your shoulder. Winter nights in a castle were long, and rituals helped anchor the mind. The chamber pot near the bed, the candle holder within reach, the warm drink, the basin, the guard's quiet breathing in the shadows. Each small action prepared the king not only for sleep, but for surrendering control in a world where cold, illness, and danger hid in the dark. You slip back out of the curtains and stand tall, feeling your muscles tighten slightly from the room's chill. Your thoughts drift toward another dimension of royal life in winter, one that carried its own challenges. Kings often travelled, even in the coldest months, and they took warmth with them in portable forms. Their bedding, stones, tools, and nightwear all had to follow wherever duty required them to sleep. You turn your gaze toward the door as though preparing for a journey, ready to explore the portable winter gear that accompanied a king on the road. You walk toward the heavy wooden door of the chamber, its iron hinges cold and still, and as you rest your palm against it, you imagine the moment when the king would leave this room in the dead of winter. Travel was not optional for a medieval monarch. Even in harsh weather, he rode out to inspect lands, attend councils, answer crises, or retreat to warmer estates. And every journey brought with it the question that now settles across your senses. How did he carry warmth with him into the unpredictable cold beyond these walls? You pull the door open and step into the imagined corridor beyond, your footsteps soft against the stone. Traveling in winter meant confronting icy winds, snowy roads and lodgings, far less comfortable than a royal chamber. So the king relied on portable winter gear, items packed carefully by attendants who understood how fragile warmth could be on the road. As you trace your hand along the wall, you picture a procession of servants moving briskly through the castle halls, arms loaded with bedding rolls, fur bundles, and small heating tools. You stop beside a wooden bench where travellers once prepared. One detail preserved in royal inventories notes the presence of thick travel quilts, sometimes stuffed with raw wool in uneven clumps that trapped heat exceptionally well. You unfold an imagined version of one such quilt, its weight settling heavily across your arms. The material feels coarse but sturdy, meant not for beauty but for endurance. Servants rolled these quilts tightly, wrapped them in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture, and strapped them to the backs of pack animals. When the king arrived at an unfamiliar lodging, the first task was to unroll these quilts and shake the travel dust from them, restoring their thickness before layering them onto a cold bed. You imagine yourself kneeling beside a wooden chest that has been carried along the journey. You lift the lid and discover a portable mattress, thinner than the one at home but surprisingly dense. It is stuffed with feathers or wool, its surface quilted in tight patterns to prevent shifting during travel. One travel record from a royal household mentions that these mattresses were rolled around poles to keep their shape and protect their stuffing. You run your hands along the imagined stitching, sensing how much effort went into creating something that might only be used for a handful of nights on the road. You rise again and move further into the corridor, imagining the bustle of departure. Footmen carry bundles of fire-starting materials. Another group handles wooden frames that hold heated stones. Portable stoves known as braziers accompany the caravan. You picture a small brazier now, its metal body thick enough to withstand travel. When you lift it, you sense its potential. These small containers held burning coals during stops, offering warmth in places where fires could not be built safely or quickly. A travel diary from a nobleman notes that such braziers allowed riders to warm their hands and faces during short rests in open country. You step into a larger imagined space, a kind of staging hall where horses once stood saddled and ready. Servants draped heavy cloaks across the king's saddle, each lined with fur and designed to wrap around both rider and mount. Some of these cloaks were so large they resembled moving tents when the king rode through snow. You lift one of these cloaks now, its incredible weight tugging at your shoulders. Beneath its folds, warmth could gather and stay close, even during long hours in freezing air. Accounts from the period mention that kings often travelled with several cloaks, each suited to a different level of cold. You notice a pair of leather saddlebags hanging against the wall. They hold more than basic supplies. Inside one, you find a small pouch of crushed herbs meant to be burned for warmth or comfort along the way. Inside, another lies a rolled fur wrap, soft and slightly scented. These wraps were placed around the king's legs or shoulders during travel. They acted like portable versions of the bedding he relied on at home. You imagine the king settling into a lodging after a long day's journey and sighing at the relief of familiar textures wrapped around him once more. You move toward another corner where stacks of wooden boxes once rested. You lift the lid of a smaller one and find inside an assortment of tools: a compact warming pan, a set of carefully wrapped stones, a small lamp, and a cloth-lined pouch for carrying coal. These were practical companions, each one designed to bridge the gap between unfamiliar lodgings and the comfort of home. Some castle logs mention that servants spent hours preparing the king's temporary bed before his arrival, using tools just like these to drive the chill from the sheets. You close the box gently and imagine stepping into a cold guest chamber in a distant manor, the air sharp with frost, the floor echoing beneath your boots. Without the king's portable bedding and heating gear, that room would feel as unwelcoming as a stone cellar. But with the bedding unrolled, the stones warmed by a portable brazier, and the blankets layered carefully, the crude chamber slowly transformed into something livable. The warmth may not equal the familiar comforts of the king's own bed, but it created a fragile pocket of peace in a world filled with cold. Your mind lingers on one especially vivid detail mentioned by a traveling chronicler. During winter journeys, servants often slept in tight clusters near the doorway of the king's chamber, their body heat forming a natural barrier against the cold air rushing in from the hall. It was as if the king traveled with a moving ring of warmth, created not only by objects, but by the people who tended him. You step back, letting the imagined scene fade gently. The door before you leads to the world beyond the castle, where portable bedding and travelling braziers became the king's shield against winter's unpredictable reach. But now your attention shifts towards something more intimate and curious. Warmth was not merely physical in the medieval imagination. It could be medicinal, protective, even magical. You turn softly toward the inner chamber again, ready to explore the herbs, charms, and beliefs that shaped how kings protected their bodies and spirits during the coldest nights. You step back into the quiet chamber, its familiar cold settling once more around your shoulders. As your gaze drifts across the space, you begin to sense something subtler woven into these winter nights. The king did not rely solely on fire, blankets, or stones to stay warm. Medieval people believed that warmth touched the body in deeper ways, connected not only to health but to fortune, protection, and even the unseen world. Inside this chamber, winter comfort lived in the overlap between medicine, superstition, and gentle ritual. You move toward a narrow wooden table positioned near the bed. On its surface lie small pouches, wooden boxes, and a handful of dried herbs scattered like forgotten fragments of a winter routine. You pick up one pouch first. It crackles softly between your fingers. Inside you find crushed rosemary, mint, and fennel. These herbs were not chosen for flavor alone. Medieval physicians believed certain plants encouraged circulation, eased shivering, or prevented the buildup of harmful cold humors in the body. You lift the pouch to your nose. Even now, a faint whisper of their scent remains, sharp and comforting. You set the pouch down and reach for a small wooden bowl beside it. Within the bowl rests a mixture of dried ginger slices and cinnamon bark. A physician's record from the period describes how spiced wine or warm tonic was prepared for the king before bed, believed to heat the blood from within. You imagine the king sitting at the edge of his bed, hands wrapped around a steaming cup, feeling the warmth travel slowly from throat to chest. Whether the drink truly improved his body temperature or simply soothed his spirit scarcely mattered. The ritual itself provided relief in the coldest hours. Your fingers brush the edge of another container, this one carved with swirling patterns. When you lift its lid, you find a bundle of small charms, a carved bone token, a smooth bead of amber, and a strip of parchment inscribed with faded lines. Some medieval kings embraced charms openly, while others kept them tucked away with quiet practicality. The belief that certain objects repelled the harm brought by cold nights was common. Amber, for example, was thought to retain warmth and guard against illness. A curious mention in a royal attendant's notes describes heating an amber bead briefly by the fire before placing it inside the king's nightcap, as though the stone's warmth could travel into his dreams. You tuck the charm back into its box and draw out a folded piece of cloth. When you unfold it, you find dried lavender tied into the shape of a tiny bundle. Lavender symbolized calm, and its fragrance was believed to ease restless spirits. Medieval sleepers often kept such bundles beneath their pillows. You hold it close, imagining the soft aroma filling the enclosed bed, blending with smoke and wool, helping the king drift toward sleep. You walk toward a small stand where several flasks once sat. These flasks held warming balms. You lift one now, feeling the cool smoothness of its clay. Inside would have been a mixture of animal fat and warming herbs like mustard seed or sage. These salves were rubbed onto the feet, chest, or hands before bed to encourage heat. A physician of the era wrote that warming the chest helped preserve breath during winter. You picture the king allowing a trusted attendant to apply the balm, its oily scent rising as it warmed beneath his skin. Setting the flask down, you move toward a dim corner of the chamber where shadows deepen. In this quieter space, superstitions once thrived. Some kings asked for protective symbols to be drawn near the bed during severe storms. A faint trace of chalk on a stone might mark where a charm was once placed to ward off harmful night winds. Stories passed quietly between servants suggested that certain breezes carried illness or ill fortune, especially during deep winter. Whether or not the king fully believed such ideas, he tolerated these rituals because they brought comfort to those who served him. You rest your hand against the stone and close your eyes. Imagine a winter night when the cold outside roars against the castle walls. The fire crackles only faintly. The bed curtains sway just enough to remind the king that drafts are searching for weaknesses. In such a moment, the presence of charms, herbs, and medicinal balms provided psychological warmth as powerful as physical heat. A king needed not only protection for his body, but also reassurance for his spirit. You open your eyes and turn back toward the table. A handful of dried juniper berries lies beside a cracked mortar. These berries were sometimes burned to scent the chamber. Some specialists point out ongoing debates about whether the practice was meant for air purification or spiritual protection. Perhaps it was both. When you crush a few berries between your fingers, a bright, resinous aroma escapes, sharp enough to cut through the heaviness of smoke and wool. The scent must have carried a sense of cleansing, as though the room itself inhaled something fresh for the first time in hours. You move slowly along the chamber, letting your hands trail over objects that bridge the line between medicine and magic. A bead warmed by the fire, a herb bundle placed beneath a pillow, a ritual marking hidden near a bedpost. These gestures remind you that medieval people navigated winter not as a purely physical challenge, but as a spiritual one too. Cold could weaken the body, but fear, loneliness, and superstition could weaken the mind. The king's nightly routines acknowledged both. You pause beside the bed once more. The curtains hang quietly, touched only by the occasional draught. Behind them lies a man surrounded by furs, blankets, heated stones, and layers of cloth. But he is also held by the warmth of belief, the comfort of rituals, and the protective imagination of those who cared for his well-being. As your gaze drifts beyond the bed toward the far reach of the chamber, you sense another presence that shaped winter nights. Not human, not herbal, not symbolic. Something living, warm, and often quietly loyal. You begin to walk toward the space where animals sometimes lay curled in the shadows, waiting to lend their simple heat to the king's long winter rest. You walk toward the dimmest corner of the chamber, where the air feels untouched and quiet, as though something once breathed softly here during long winter nights. Medieval kings, despite their wealth, were not above accepting help from the simplest source of warmth: animals. In a world where stone walls held cold like a memory, the heat of a living creature could make the difference between shivering through the night and drifting into steady sleep. You pause in the quiet, imagining a soft rustle of fur, a faint exhale, a gentle shift of weight on the floor. You lower yourself onto a thick rug and slide your hand across its fibers. The space here would have been perfect for a royal dog, curled tightly into a warm spiral. Many accounts from the period mention companion animals lingering near their masters during winter. Hunting dogs were especially favored, not only for their loyalty, but for their natural warmth. You picture a large hound settling near the foot of the king's bed, its body radiating heat, its breath releasing small clouds into the cold air. The presence of such a creature offered more than physical comfort. It brought a sense of companionship, a reminder that warmth could be alive and responsive. You imagine the way the dog might shift during the night, stretching one leg, sighing contentedly as the fire crackled low. Some nobles allowed smaller dogs to sleep directly on the bed. Their fur, their movement, and their curled bodies added gentle pockets of warmth beneath blankets. A traveler's diary even describes a king who kept a tiny lapdog within his bed curtains during the coldest weeks, believing the animal's warmth eased his stiff joints. You smile faintly at the thought, realizing how deeply human the instinct is to draw comfort from a warm creature on a winter night. You rise slowly and take a few steps toward a darker corner, where the chamber meets a trough-like alcove along the floor. Here, you picture another presence, a small cluster of palace cats. These creatures roamed freely, both beloved and necessary. They controlled mice, protected stored food, and sometimes chose to linger near sources of warmth. Cats often curled up near hearths, resting so close to the embers that attendants joked about them becoming fire spirits. If a cat wandered into the king's chamber, it was not unusual for it to nestle against draped curtains or lie atop a warm stone left cooling on the floor. The king might not openly invite them into his bed, but their occasional presence warmed the room in small but meaningful ways. You trail your fingers along the alcove's edge and sense the lingering impression of such quiet companions. Their warmth was subtle, but their movement added life to winter's stillness. Some manuscripts include miniature illustrations of sleeping kings, with cats curled at their feet or nestled beside their boots. Whether these depictions were literal or symbolic, they suggest that animals played a gentle role in the nightly rhythm of a castle. You turn toward a wooden partition near the far wall. Behind it, servants sometimes sheltered horses brought in for emergency travel. Though this practice varied widely, stories from regions facing especially harsh winters mention that important mounts were occasionally kept indoors overnight to prevent them from freezing. You imagine their warm breath filling the air with steam, their bodies radiating heat that softened the chill of the surrounding space. A horse's presence inside the king's chamber would have been rare, but in certain war camps or temporary palace setups, it happened out of necessity. Their warmth was powerful enough to affect the room's temperature. You step away from the partition, listening to the imagined rhythm of animals breathing in the winter dark. Their warmth, unlike fire or blankets, carried a kind of companionship that soothed the mind. A living creature pauses beside the bed, shifts position, and the king knows he is not alone with the cold. One chronicler recorded a moment when a royal hound, sensing a particularly frigid night, climbed onto the fur blankets uninvited. Instead of being scolded, it was allowed to stay because its body heat offered immediate comfort. The detail feels tender, a small victory against the winter. You walk back toward the middle of the chamber and place your hand on the rug once more. Animals also influenced the atmosphere invisibly. Their presence warmed the floor, and their bodies created pockets of still air, breaking up the drafts that slipped around the room. Even if the king never touched them, he benefited from the heat they shared with the space. You lift your eyes toward the bed curtains, imagining the faint sounds that filtered through them, a soft scratch, a muffled thump, the quiet breathing of a dog settling down. These small noises stitch themselves into the nighttime symphony of winter. The king might have drifted to sleep feeling that mix of fire crackle, draft whisper, and animal warmth. A blend of sounds and sensations that belonged uniquely to life inside cold stone walls. You stand fully now, and stretch your fingers toward the ceiling. Winter nights were long, and anything that added warmth was welcomed. Animals, humble and steady, offered the king a form of comfort that came naturally, without tools or rituals. Their warmth had a heartbeat. Their presence softened the edges of winter in ways neither stones nor fire could fully replicate. As the imagined warmth fades back into silence, you notice a faint shift in the room's atmosphere, a distant thrum, a low vibration, the suggestion of movement beyond the walls. Winter storms, fierce and persistent, often shaped the king's sleep just as much as the warmth at his bedside. Their presence entered the chamber whether welcome or not. You turn your gaze toward the shuttered window, ready to step into the world of winter storms and the uneasy calm they imposed upon the king's nights. You step toward the shuttered window, the faintest tremor of cold brushing against your cheek, as if carried by a memory of storms long past. Winter in a medieval castle was never quiet for long. Beyond these stone walls, Winds roared like living creatures, rattling towers, clawing at shutters, and groaning through arrow slits with a voice that felt almost human. As you rest your hand on the wooden frame, you sense the echo of those nights when storms shaped not only the castle's atmosphere, but the king's sleep itself. You press your palm to the shutter. It is cold enough to sting. Imagine it trembling under the force of a January gale, its hinges protesting as gusts slam against the wall. Some chronicles describe storm winds so fierce they made the bed curtains sway even with the shutters tightly closed. You picture the fabric moving in slow, uneasy breaths, as if responding to the storm's rhythm. The king, half awake beneath his blankets, would hear the deep, distant hum of the wind reverberating through stone, a sound that filled the chamber like the droning note of a giant organ. You slide your hand downward and feel a faint draft creeping from the base of the window. Storms magnified every weakness in a castle's architecture. No matter how many tapestries, shutters, or cloths the attendants pressed into cracks, wind found its way inside. One account, written by a castle steward, describes storms that pushed snow through the tiniest gaps, scattering powder across the floor in thin, glittering trails. You imagine a servant waking the king at dawn, sweeping away that stubborn dusting of winter before anyone else could see it. You walk away from the window and stand still in the middle of the chamber, closing your eyes for a moment. Listen. The storm begins softly in your imagination, a faint whistle, a low moan around the battlements. Then the wind grows bolder. It surges, it presses, it howls through the narrow passages of the castle's outer walls. Storms did more than bring cold. They brought noise. They brought movement. They reminded everyone inside, including the king, that nature held a power even stone walls could not silence. You open your eyes again and step toward the bed. Picture the king lying there, nestled in his sea of blankets, feeling the rhythm of the storm like another presence in the room. A travel writer from the 14th century once wrote that wind during winter crept into dreams and pulled at the wandering mind. You sense the truth in that observation. Storms shaped the king's subconscious. They influenced his dreams, his restlessness, his mood upon waking. A sleepless winter night could make a ruler irritable the next morning, altering the tone of counsels and decisions. You rest your hand lightly on one of the bed curtains. Even now, you can imagine how they fluttered during tempests. Not wildly, but subtly. A faint ripple, a soft sway. Enough to remind the sleeper that the world outside churned with energy and cold. Some servants believed that if the bed curtains moved without being touched, it meant the wind carried warnings or omens. A few even tied tiny cloth weights to the bottom edges to keep the curtains from swaying too freely. You picture those little weights now, swaying gently as the storm pushes against the castle walls. You turn toward the hearth. Storms affected fires too. Sudden drafts made flames sputter or smoke unpredictably. A gust through a hidden crack could send a burst of sparks leaping upward. One letter, written by a royal attendant during a severe winter storm, mentions that the king's chamber filled with smoke late at night, forcing him to cough awake and call for help. You see the scene unfold, embers glowing, the firekeeper rushing in half asleep, the king pulling his blankets up against the cold, while the attendants scrambled to control the unruly flames. You kneel near the hearth and run your fingers along the stone. On storm nights, servants often had to shield the fire with makeshift blocks or stand between the hearth and the draught to keep smoke from spreading. Imagine them positioned here, their cloaks buffeted by air currents, their faces lit by flickering orange light, trying to keep the room habitable while the storm rattled the shutters like angry fists. You rise and walk slowly across the room, feeling the shifting temperatures beneath your feet. Storms created strange patterns in the air. Warm pockets formed near the fire, while icy gusts lingered near the door. The king would feel these contrasting zones as he moved within the chamber. One step warm, the next step cold. This uneven layering of air added a kind of unpredictability to the night. It kept the senses alert even when the mind longed for rest. You pause beside the doorway. Drafts slipped under doors more aggressively during storms. Some guards reported feeling their legs freeze even as their upper bodies stayed relatively warm. You imagine a guard posted just outside the door, gripping his spear, the wind battering him with each passing minute. His presence, revealed only by the soft shuffle of boots, reassured the king but cost him comfort. Storm nights were long for everyone. Returning to the center of the chamber, you tilt your head and imagine the thunder. When it rolled across the sky, it echoed inside the stone like distant drums. Lightning illuminated the room in pale flashes, transforming furniture into ghostly silhouettes. A chronicler once described the king waking during a storm to see his own shadow stretched across the opposite wall, distorted and enormous. He reportedly joked the next morning that he had dreamed of giants. But storms did not always inspire humor. Some nights, they brought unease. In medieval thought, storms carried symbolic weight. They were associated with divine warnings, mystical signs or shifts in fortune. Kings often listened to them with a mixture of awe and caution. If a storm struck on the eve of an important decision, whispers might circulate about whether fate was speaking. Even inside the warm cocoon of his bed, the king might lie awake, listening to hail strike the tower or wind scream through the crenellations, wondering what message the night carried. Returning to the center of the chamber, you tilt your head and imagine the thunder. When it rolled across the sky, it echoed inside the stone like distant drums. Lightning illuminated the room in pale flashes, transforming furniture into ghostly silhouettes. A chronicler once described the king waking during a storm to see his own shadow stretch across the opposite wall, distorted and enormous. He reportedly joked the next morning that he had dreamed of giants. You let your hand drop gently to your side. Winter storms taught medieval rulers humility. They reminded them that no amount of wealth or power could shut out the world entirely. Even a king listened to the wind with a hint of respect. You step back from the bed, letting the imagined storm settle into silence around you. The room now feels still, watchful. Storms passed eventually, but their memory lingered in the king's mind long after the sky cleared. As your thoughts settle, your attention shifts towards something far more grounded. The people who remained vigilant during those long nights. Guards who stood watch. Servants who stayed alert. Companions who ensured the king's sleep remained safe in a world full of threats. You turn toward the doorway again, ready to explore the tense, protective atmosphere surrounding a sleeping monarch on a winter night. You move slowly toward the chamber doorway, where the shadows thicken and the cold settles differently, as though the air here remembers the weight of vigilance. A king never slept unguarded, not even during the gentlest nights of summer, and certainly not during the ruthless depths of winter. The cold was harsh, yes, but danger was harsher. Beyond these curtains, beyond the circle of warmth around the bed, an entire world of watchfulness unfolded every night. You pause near the heavy door, resting your palm against the grain. It feels rigid, biting with chill, the way old wood stiffens when winter presses against it. Imagine this door closed firmly at night, its latch secured, its edges lined with rolled cloth to block the draft. But even in this sealed state, you sense the presence of the people who once stood just beyond it. Guards, attendants, watchmen, their duty never slept. You step back and picture a guard positioned here, wrapped in a layered cloak, gripping his spear with hands numbed by cold. His breath would rise in quiet white puffs each time he exhaled. He would shift his weight occasionally, perhaps rolling his shoulders to keep from stiffening. A guard's responsibility was absolute. Listen for the slightest sound, watch for any movement in the corridor, and protect the king even if his own teeth chattered. A record kept by a royal marshal explains that guard rotations sped up during winter because the cold weakened alertness. No one could endure hours in near-freezing corridors without relief. You turn your head, imagining the muffled footsteps of another guard approaching to take over the position. The two exchange only a whispered greeting, voices low enough not to disturb the king. One steps away gratefully, boots tapping lightly on stone. The other slides into place with a hand brushing the wall, grounding himself in the cold, the dark, and the weight of responsibility. Moving deeper into the chamber again, you glance toward a small bench where an attendant might have sat inside the room itself, just far enough from the bed to maintain decorum, yet close enough to respond instantly. His presence was a quiet anchor against the uncertainties of the night. If the king stirred, coughed, or called in the darkness, this attendant would rise immediately. A surviving letter from a court servant describes how he learned to read the king's breathing, knowing whether to remain still or approach with quiet steps. You approach that imagined bench now and rest your hand along its edge. The wood feels cold, but you picture the warmth of a person sitting there, boots tucked beneath him, cloak wrapped tightly, fingers interlaced for warmth. He listens not only for the king but for any sign of trouble. Unfamiliar footsteps outside, a latch shifting, or the distant clatter of armor echoing up the stairway. Even the crack of firewood collapsing in the hearth could make him glance upward, trained to distinguish harmless sounds from those that demanded action. You walk toward the center of the room, letting your gaze drift to the fire's remains. A dying fire was both an inconvenience and a risk. Too little flame, and the room grew dangerously cold. Too much flame, and sparks threatened the bed curtains. Guards and attendants monitoring the fire stood watch with caution, ready to bank embers or adjust logs with controlled precision. One detailed account from a castle's winter logbook describes the process of banking the fire as a nightly ritual of judgment, because the wrong choice could either fill the room with smoke or allow the temperature to plummet. You kneel for a moment near the hearth, imagining the attendant warming his chilled fingers briefly before stepping back into position. He would not linger. Guards did not have the luxury of comfort. The cold was part of their duty, a constant test of endurance. Their bodies stood between the king and the dangers of the night. You stand again, letting your feet carry you slowly toward the bed curtains. You do not open them, but you rest your fingertips gently on their edge. Imagine the king inside, drifting somewhere between sleep and awareness, trusting implicitly that the people outside these curtains remain vigilant. That trust was heavy. It rested on loyalty, fear, reward, and a lifetime of training. A disloyal guard could end a kingdom in a heartbeat. A faithful one became an invisible guardian, enduring the cold without complaint. In some courts, the king's personal guard slept in an adjoining chamber with the door open, allowing them to rush in if needed. Other times, guards were stationed along the staircase leading up to the royal floor, spaced at intervals, each responsible for a section. You imagine these men standing like silent markers of protection, forming a human chain between the king and the outside world. But guarding the king did not rely solely on human presence. The room itself carried signs of protection. You notice a metal hook on the wall where a lantern once hung, burning through the night for visibility. You trace its outline and imagine its flickering light revealing shadows that guards would study carefully. Lanterns illuminated corners, kept fear at bay, and allowed guards to see if someone approached with ill intentions. You move deeper into the dim chamber again, and picture a night when tension ran high. Perhaps rumors of political unrest circulated. Perhaps the king had angered a rival. On such nights, guards stood with taut attention, listening so intently that even the falling ashes from a log sounded suspicious. Their nervous energy filled the room, blending with the stormy cold or the still silence beyond the walls. You lift your gaze toward the ceiling, imagining a faint sound drifting down from higher floors, perhaps the shuffle of a spy, the groan of a loose board, or the brush of a cloak caught on stone. Guards would stiffen instantly, exchanging subtle glances. A quiet investigation might follow, feet moving in unison across the cold stone. Returning your focus to the center of the room, you sense a strange duality. The king slept in the warmest space of the castle, wrapped in layers, surrounded by protective rituals and insulated by his bed curtains. Yet at the same time, He slept at the heart of a tense and alert atmosphere. Every breath of the guards, every flicker of the fire, every whisper of a draft became part of an invisible network of defense. You take a slow breath, feeling the heaviness of that responsibility in the air around you. The king's rest depended on others staying awake. His warmth depended on others resisting the cold. His safety depended on ears, trained to detect danger in the slightest sound. It is a sobering thought, one that leaves a subtle imprint across the chamber's dimness. And yet, despite the tension, there were moments in these winter nights when calm returned, when voices grew soft again, and the chamber filled with warmth of a different kind. Conversation, quiet stories, gentle companionship shared by firelight. You turn your body slightly toward the hearth, sensing the warmth of remembered voices lingering in the air, ready to guide you into the late-night conversations that softened winter's edge for a sleeping king. You walk toward the hearth once more, drawn by the memory of warmth and the echo of voices that once gathered here during the quiet hours before sleep. The fire may be low now, reduced to a soft cradle of embers, but you can almost hear the whispers that filled this chamber on long winter nights. Conversation, gentle and unhurried, helped soothe the tension of the day. It eased the cold in places no blanket or warming stone could reach. You pause beside the fire and lower yourself onto a small stool, its wooden surface cool beneath you. Imagine the king seated nearby, wrapped in a heavy mantle, hands extended toward the gentle glow, his face softened by fatigue, his shoulders lowering as the responsibilities of the day settled into temporary silence. Behind him, an attendant adjusts a log, coaxing it into a slow crackle that casts fluttering shadows across the walls. This was a moment for stories, for memories, for quiet words exchanged under the shield of flames. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the imagined cadence of these conversations surround you. Some nights, the king might speak with a trusted advisor about matters of state, their voices low but calm. The fire's gentle snapping punctuates their dialogue, giving rhythm to their thoughts. A royal chronicle from the era notes that winter evenings often provided the best environment for reflection. The cold outside sharpened the awareness of what mattered inside. The hush of the chamber encouraged honesty, even vulnerability. You open your eyes and study the shadows dancing along the far wall. Those shadows once mirrored the movements of people gathering around the fire. A companion might share a humorous tale from a hunting expedition, making the king's laughter echo softly through the room. Humor, even subtle humor, warmed the air as effectively as heat. One preserved anecdote describes a king laughing so freely at a bedtime story that even the guards outside the door smiled through their shivering. You rise from the stool and move toward a small table positioned near the bed. On it sits a carved cup. You pick it up gently, feeling its cool surface. The king may have held this cup hours earlier, drinking warm, spiced wine as he listened to a story or offered one of his own. Drinks eased tongues and softened the barrier between ruler and companion. Some attendants recorded how these quiet conversations revealed a more human side of the monarch, glimpses rarely seen during formal daylight hours. Setting the cup down, you turn toward a cushioned chair situated slightly away from the bed. It seems perfectly placed for someone invited to linger but not intrude. You touch the fabric and imagine a trusted confidant sitting there, speaking softly about distant lands or childhood memories. These stories were not political. They were personal, warm and grounding. On winter nights, when the outside world felt brittle with frost, such recollections created an inner warmth that touched even the most guarded hearts. You take a few steps toward the window, listening for the imagined roar of a storm beyond. When winds raged against the castle walls, the king and his companions sometimes spoke of old battles or ancient legends. The relationship between weather and storytelling runs deep. A storm makes every tale feel larger, every memory more vivid. One courtier wrote that winter storms pulled stories from the tongue the way heat draws scent from herbs, suggesting that the fiercer the wind outside, the deeper the stories became. You turn back toward the fire. Its glow gives the room a golden texture, softening the sharpness of stone. You imagine the king leaning back, eyes heavy, listening to a servant's gentle singing. Songs accompanied many winter nights. Lullabies, hymns, or old folk tunes wrapped the room in sound as warm as the blankets that awaited him. Even kings needed comfort. Music reached the places that warmth alone could not. As you walk slowly along the chamber's perimeter, your fingers trailing over the tapestries, you sense the stillness that came after these conversations. When the stories ended and the laughter faded, a hush settled across the room. The king might offer a final word to his attendants, a quiet goodnight or a thoughtful remark. Then the curtains closed around him. The warm glow of companionship gave way to the solitary intimacy of sleep. But those moments of shared conversation lingered even after the fire died down. They shaped the tone of the king's dreams, influenced his sense of peace, and strengthened the trust between him and the people who shared his long winter evenings. Words spoken beside the fire became part of the chamber's very air, settling into its stones like the fading scent of herbs. You pause in the center of the room and take a slow breath. The chamber feels fuller now, as though the faint, imagined voices of past winter nights still ripple in the air. These conversations added warmth that no fire could provide. They softened the edges of worry and made the castle feel less like a fortress of stone and more like a place of human connection. But warmth in a medieval castle was never guaranteed. No matter how carefully the king was tended, how many blankets were piled upon him, or how lively the stories at the hearth became, there were nights when the cold overwhelmed all efforts, nights when even kings felt winter's bite. You turn gently toward the far, darker side of the chamber, ready to step into the moments when warmth failed and winter won. You move toward the darkest reach of the chamber, where even the ghost of the fire's warmth cannot stretch. Here, the air grows sharper, almost metallic against your skin. This corner carries the memory of nights when every effort failed, when the cold pushed through layers of stone and fabric with a relentlessness that humbled even those wrapped in royal power. No amount of fur, no collection of warming stones, no attentive servant could always keep winter at bay. Sometimes, the cold won. You pause beside the window recess, running your fingertips along the deep groove cut into the wall. It feels colder than before, as if the stone itself stores the memory of the harshest winters. Imagine a night when the wind outside screamed without pause. Snow fell in thick sheeting waves, and the temperature plummeted with punishing speed. Even the king's best tapestries could not fully silence the draft. One surviving castle account mentions a winter so brutal that frost formed along the inside edges of window frames, sparkling faintly in the lamplight like cruel decorations. You picture an attendant touching that frost with the tip of a finger, then quickly pulling back, startled by the bite. You step nearer to the bed, feeling the uneven temperature of the room, a warm pocket near the hearth, a cold ribbon of air near the door, a strange stillness near the far wall. On the worst nights, these contrasting zones became more pronounced. Even within the enclosure of curtains, warmth sometimes thinned too quickly. A few historical letters describe kings waking with stiff fingers or feet, despite the mountain of blankets piled on them. One writer recalls the king joking that the only thing colder than the stone walls was his own nose upon waking. You move closer to the hearth. Even now you sense how a fire's struggle could shape an entire night. On mild evenings, logs burned evenly and softly, filling the room with a steady, soothing comfort. But in bitter cold, wood burned faster, split unpredictably, or hissed with moisture trapped deep inside. A small gust sneaking down the chimney might send a spray of sparks into the room or, worse, cause the flame to collapse entirely. A court steward's notes describe a particularly harsh winter evening when the king ordered extra firewood brought to the chamber every 2 hours. Still, the heat evaporated into the vastness of the room almost as soon as it formed. You kneel beside the hearth and press your palm near where the embers would have been. The faint warmth seems fragile, easily overwhelmed. You imagine the fire dimming to nothing in the middle of the night, leaving only the cold glow of dying coals and the sharp scent of wet ash. A servant would have had to rouse himself, shivering, to rekindle it. But even with skillful hands, the flame could take precious minutes to catch. During that time, the cold crept deeper into the chamber, settling into the king's blankets, his pillows, his bones. You stand again and walk toward the foot of the bed. Imagine the king pulling his blankets tighter, curling instinctively against the chill. His breath rises in small clouds. The air inside the curtains feels thinner, not truly warm but simply less cold than the space outside. Even the thickest furs cannot prevent the initial shock when he first shifts in the night. One passage recorded by a royal attendant mentions the sound the king sometimes made on the coldest nights. A soft, involuntary hiss as his skin met a patch of chilled bedding that had slipped away from a warming stone. You lift the bed curtain slightly and slip your hand inside. The air is still, but the temperature is uneven. Some portions feel acceptably warm, others feel uncomfortably cool. This inconsistency was common in medieval beds. Heat had to be gathered and preserved constantly, and when a warming stone cooled or a servant misjudged the timing, the warmth faded too quickly. A physician's observational notes from the period describe a king waking stiff with cold after a warming pan burned out early, leaving the foot of the bed nearly frozen to the touch. Stepping away from the bed, you walk toward a small wooden table, where winter remedies once rested. Imagine a scene where the king, coughing lightly in the chill, reaches for a warm drink made earlier in the evening. By now it has cooled completely. The surface of the liquid feels icy. The remedy offers no comfort. Even medicines designed to encourage warmth lose their strength when the cold advances faster than human effort can counter it. In some winter accounts, illnesses worsened simply because rooms could not stay warm through the night. Chilled air aggravated breathing, stiffened joints, and made sleep shallow. You turn toward the stone wall again and press your palm flat against it. The cold seeps into your hand with merciless steadiness. On the worst nights, these walls radiated cold so intensely that even standing near them for too long made a person's limbs ache. A fragment from a noblewoman's letter describes watching the king step away from the wall in frustration, after the cold pierced through his nightclothes despite standing several feet from it. She wrote that the room felt carved from winter itself. You let your gaze drift toward the floor. Thick rugs usually softened the stone's chill, but even they failed sometimes. Beneath them, frost could form silently during severe weather, creating a subtle crunch when stepped on in the early hours. One castle servant recounted discovering frost crystals beneath a rug near the king's bed. He spent nearly an hour warming the area with heated stones before the king awoke. You continue walking, sensing the quiet heaviness that settles into the room when warmth falters. Sleep becomes uncertain. Each breath feels colder than the last. Dreams turn restless. You imagine the king's attendants exchanging uneasy looks in the dimness, knowing their efforts cannot fully tame the cold. They move more often, adjusting blankets, adding stones, whispering updates to one another as though fighting a silent enemy. Their movements create small swirls of cold air that seep into the bed curtains, despite every attempt to keep them still. You pause at the threshold of the room and listen. You can almost hear the castle's winter voice, the groan of timbers contracting with cold, the faint crackle of frost forming along the outer walls, the sharp whistle of wind twisting through high corridors. These sounds reminded the king that no matter how much help he received, winter maintained the upper hand. You step slowly back to the center of the room, letting the balance of cold and lingering warmth settle around you. There is a certain humility in these moments. Even a king, with all his wealth and attendants, faced nights when winter simply refused to yield. Yet these failures did not break the rhythm of his life. Instead, they guided him toward the final refuge of warmth that waited deeper within the castle. You breathe softly, feeling the chill press gently against your skin as the chamber grows still. Your attention shifts toward the inner heart of the royal quarters, where the king sought the ultimate retreat on the coldest nights. You turn toward the deepest part of the royal quarters, a space tucked behind a heavy inner door where the cold struggled to reach and the air felt thicker, almost sheltered. Every castle had such a place. It was not grand like the Great Hall, nor impressive like the king's receiving chambers. It was functional, private, designed with one purpose in mind: to protect the monarch from winter's most unforgiving nights. You walk slowly toward this imagined sanctuary, feeling the temperature shift as though you are stepping further into the castle's warmest heartbeat. You reach the inner doorway and rest your palm against it. The wood is smoother than the outer door, worn by years of hands passing through. You imagine the king retreating here after a night when even the main chamber proved too cold. He would rise from his bed, wrap himself in a heavy cloak, and move with quiet steps into this hidden refuge. Only a few attendants would follow him, carrying warming stones, furs, and a small lantern. Their breath showed visibly in the dimness, but the chill felt different here, less biting, more contained. You step through the doorway and enter the king's inner retreat. In your mind, the walls are lined with thick hangings that reach from ceiling to floor, overlapping slightly so no crack remains exposed. The fabric absorbs the cold, muffles the outside noise, and holds warmth like a deep breath. You approach one tapestry and press your hand lightly against it. Beneath your palm, you sense the faint warmth of wool tightly woven. These hangings were softer, denser, and far more expensive than those in the outer chamber. Some were lined with fur, some were doubled. Their purpose was not decoration but insulation. You move toward the hearth at the far end of the room. It is smaller than the main chamber's fireplace, but expertly crafted to radiate heat efficiently. Its stones are closer together, forming a snug cradle around the flames. You kneel beside the hearth and imagine a fire burning low but steady, its warmth spreading evenly rather than shooting upward and disappearing into high ceilings. A royal accounts ledger describes how this inner hearth was stocked with seasoned wood, carefully chosen for dryness and consistency. The goal was an uninterrupted burn, with minimal smoke and maximum heat. You lift a log, feeling its weight. Even in your imagination, you can tell someone selected it with care. As you stand, your attention shifts to a low wooden platform at the center of the room. On it sits a smaller bed, far less ornate than the grand bed in the main chamber. It is closer to the floor, surrounded by thick rugs, and protected on all sides by layered curtains. You approach it slowly. This bed was not meant for show. It was built for survival. The king came here when cold storms grew unbearable, or when sickness made him crave a tighter, warmer space. You lift the edge of the blanket and feel its heaviness, the way it falls like a warm wave across your skin. Inside the bed curtains, the air feels still. You slip your hand between the folds and sense a pocket of accumulated warmth. The structure is smaller, more intimate. There is less space for heat to escape. The blankets are thicker here, the furs more luxurious, the pillows arranged to cradle the body. A detailed note from a royal household inventory describes winter bedding reserved specifically for this inner retreat. Furs from lynx, beaver or fox were preferred, prized for their ability to hold heat even when temperatures plunged sharply. You place a warming stone on the mattress. In your imagination, it has just been wrapped in fresh cloth, still radiating heat. The stone sinks slightly into the bedding, releasing a slow, comforting warmth that spreads across the blanket. This inner retreat relied heavily on such stones. Here, attendants rotated them more frequently, knowing this was where the king relied on consistent warmth during the harshest nights. You walk around the bed, noticing a set of shelves built into the wall. On them rest small objects meant to support the king through cold nights: a flask of warm drink, a jar of soothing balm, a wool-lined hood for sleeping, and a pair of soft gloves. These items offer both comfort and reassurance. The inner room was not simply warmer. It was quieter. It was protected. It was a place where the king could let down the stiffness of duty and surrender to rest. You step back and look around the room as though seeing it through the king's eyes. The flicker of the smaller hearth casts gentle light across the hangings. The air moves slowly, barely disturbed by drafts. Even the sound of the storm outside is softened into a distant hum. You imagine the king settling into the bed, pulling the blankets to his chin and exhaling deeply as the warmth envelops him. Here, he is not a ruler,